Hey Dead Signal FM viewers, getting ready for bed? Wishing you a calm and cozy night. Before we start, where are you watching from and what time is it? Let's get started. The Things Below King's Hollow, Part 1, The Return. Martin Shaw stared through the windshield as rain pelted his rental car, the wipers struggling against the autumn deluge. The two-lane highway cut through dense Maine forest, a tunnel of darkness punctuated only by his headlights. The GPS had lost signal 20 minutes back, but it didn't matter. Some roads you never forget, no matter how long you've been away. A wooden sign appeared in the gloom. King's Hollow, 847, founded 1802. The population had been 1,216 when he left. He wondered briefly what had claimed those missing 369 souls. Death, relocation, escape. Martin slowed the car and turned onto the unmarked road leading into town. Had the sign always looked that weathered, that ominous? Maybe his memory had softened the edges of this place, or maybe 30 years away had simply allowed him to forget the way King's Hollow had of making everything look slightly wrong, slightly off-kilter. He'd fled at 18, determined never to return. Even when his father died 12 years later, he declined to come back for the funeral. But now his mother was gone too, and there was the matter of the house to settle. 2 weeks, he'd promised himself. 2 weeks to clean out the family home, sign whatever papers needed signing, and leave this place behind forever. Again, Main Street was deserted at 8:35 p.m., though weak light spilled from Dooley's Tavern and the 24-hour gas station at the far end of town. Everything else was dark: the hardware store, the post office, the small municipal building, the library where his mother had worked for 40 years. The rain transformed the street lamps into hazy globes of yellow light that did little to dispel the pressing darkness. Martin's rental car splashed through puddles as he turned onto Prospect Hill Road, the steep incline leading to the neighborhood where he'd grown up. The Shaw family home stood at the end of a cul-de-sac, a 2-story colonial that had once been white but now appeared gray in the darkness, its paint peeling in long strips like dead skin. He parked in the driveway and sat for a moment, listening to the rain drumming on the roof. The house seemed to watch him, its darkened windows like vacant eyes. I don't want to go in there, he thought, the realization hitting him with surprising force. I don't want to set foot in that house ever again. But that was ridiculous. It was just a house, wood and plaster and old memories. Nothing more. Besides, he'd made reservations nowhere else, and the nearest hotel was 40 miles back. Martin grabbed his suitcase from the trunk and hurried through the rain to the covered porch. The key his mother's lawyer had mailed him slid into the lock with a familiar resistance. The door swung open with a long, low creak. The smell hit him first: dust and mildew and something else, something chemical, like old medicine or cleaning products. His hand found the light switch on the wall, and a dim bulb flickered to life in the entryway. The house was exactly as he remembered it, frozen in time. The same faded wallpaper with its pattern of small blue flowers. The same heavy oak furniture. The same photographs lining the staircase, though he noticed immediately that all pictures containing him had been removed. His footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor as he moved through the first floor. The kitchen, with its ancient refrigerator and yellowed linoleum. The formal dining room that had only been used for holidays. The living room with its sagging couch and armchair angled toward the television. And his father's study, the door slightly ajar. Martin paused, his heart suddenly hammering in his chest. His father had enforced one rule above all others: never enter the study without permission. For a moment, Martin was 12 years old again, frozen in the hallway, terrified of the consequences of crossing that threshold unbidden. Then he shook his head and pushed the door open. The study was the only room that had changed significantly. His father's desk and chair remained, but the walls of bookshelves had been emptied, their contents packed into cardboard boxes stacked against the wall. A fine layer of dust covered everything. Martin approached the desk and ran his fingers over its surface. This was where his father had spent countless hours, ostensibly working on the local history books he published through a small regional press. Books that few people read, but that had earned Bernard Shaw a reputation as King's Hollow's unofficial historian. The desktop was empty except for a single manila folder. Martin opened it to find a letter written in his mother's precise handwriting. "Martin, if you're reading this, I finally passed on. The cancer took longer than expected, but Dr. Rayburn says that's common with this type. Don't feel bad about not coming home while I was sick. I understood. There are things you need to know. Things about your father, about King's Hollow, about why I always told you to leave and never come back. I wanted to protect you from all this, but now I fear I've only delayed the inevitable. Look in the basement, behind your father's old workbench. There's a loose stone in the foundation wall. Behind it, you'll find a metal box containing his journals. Read them, Martin. Read them and understand why this town is wrong, why it's dangerous, why it's dying, and then leave. Leave King's Hollow and never return. Whatever you do, don't go near the quarry. Mom." Martin stared at the letter, a chill creeping up his spine despite the stuffiness of the room. His mother had always been practical to the point of severity, unsentimental and straightforward. This didn't sound like her at all. He folded the letter and slipped it into his pocket. Maybe she'd written it while medicated, confused from pain or treatments. That had to be it. Because the alternative, that there really was something wrong with King's Hollow, something beyond the ordinary sadness and isolation of small-town life, was too disturbing to contemplate. Rain continued to lash against the windows as Martin carried his suitcase upstairs to his old bedroom. The twin bed was still there, covered with a faded quilt. Posters he'd left behind: Nirvana, Pearl Jam, movie posters for The Crow, and Pulp Fiction still adorned the walls, their edges curled with age. His old desk stood in the corner, its surface bare. Martin set his suitcase on the bed and went to the window. From here, he could see across town to where the quarry cut into the hillside on the opposite ridge. Even in the darkness and rain, the gash in the earth was visible, a deeper pocket of black against the night sky. King's Hollow Quarry had been abandoned decades before Martin was born, but it had been a source of endless fascination for local kids. It was where teenagers went to drink and make out, where dares were issued and accepted, where urban legends flourished. It was also strictly off-limits, surrounded by chain-link fence and warning signs. Martin had only been there once, the summer he turned 13. The memory surfaced unbidden. Tommy Dufresne boosting him over the fence, the five of them picking their way down the steep slope, the still, black water at the bottom reflecting the stars, the strange, concentric circles on the quarry wall that Tommy's older brother said were fossils but didn't look like any fossils Martin had ever seen in books. And then the noise from beneath the water, the ripples spreading across the surface when nothing had fallen in. The way Tommy had screamed and pointed at something Martin couldn't see. The way Jerry Winters had fallen or jumped into the quarry water and never surfaced again. Martin shook his head, dispelling the memory. That was 30 years ago. Water under the bridge, or in this case, water in the quarry. He turned away from the window and began unpacking his suitcase, trying to ignore the way the house seemed to settle around him with sighs and creaks that sounded almost like whispers. Morning brought weak sunlight filtering through clouds and a sense of unease that sleep had done nothing to dispel. Martin showered in the bathroom with its ancient fixtures and peeling wallpaper, then dressed in jeans and a sweater. The house was cold despite it being early October. The furnace was probably acting up again. As he made his way downstairs, Martin tried to formulate a plan for the day. He needed to meet with his mother's lawyer downtown, start sorting through the house to decide what to keep and what to discard, and maybe begin reaching out to local realtors about listing the property. The kitchen looked less grim in daylight, though the ancient appliances still gave it a time capsule feel. Martin put on a pot of coffee, thankfully. His mother had kept the pantry stocked with non-perishables, and leaned against the counter as it brewed. His eyes were drawn to the basement door next to the refrigerator. His mother's letter had mentioned something hidden behind his father's workbench down there. Just thinking about the basement made Martin's skin crawl, though he couldn't articulate why. It had always been his father's domain, a place Martin was allowed to visit only under supervision. Even after Bernard Shaw died, Martin's mother had kept it locked. The coffee maker sputtered to completion. Martin filled a mug, added sugar, and carried it to the kitchen table. He'd check the basement later. First, he needed caffeine and a game plan for the day. A sharp knock at the front door made him jump, sloshing hot coffee onto his hand. Martin swore and grabbed a dish towel to mop up the spill. Who would be visiting at... He checked his watch, 8:15 in the morning. When he opened the door, he found a woman in her early 60s standing on the porch, clutching a covered casserole dish. She had silver-streaked brown hair cut into a practical bob and wore a cable-knit sweater over corduroy pants. Her eyes widened when she saw him. "Martin Shaw," she said, a note of something, surprise, alarm, in her voice. "I heard you were back in town, but I hardly believed it." Martin studied her face, trying to place her. Recognition dawned slowly. "Mrs. Winters," he said. "Beverly." She nodded, her expression softening slightly. "It's been a long time. 30 years, Martin confirmed. Her son Jerry had been one of Martin's friends, one of the boys at the quarry that night. The boy who had disappeared beneath the black water. "May I come in?" Beverly asked. "I brought a breakfast casserole. Thought you might not have had time to get groceries yet." Martin stepped aside to let her enter, suddenly conscious of the house's neglected state. "That's very kind of you. I was just having coffee." Beverly moved past him into the house with the familiarity of someone who'd been there many times before. Martin followed her to the kitchen, where she set the casserole on the counter and turned to face him. "Your mother was my closest friend, especially after." She trailed off, her eyes clouding. "Well, after Jerry. She was there for me when no one else knew what to say." Martin nodded, unsure how to respond. He'd never known that his mother and Beverly Winters had been close. Then again, there was apparently a lot he didn't know about Eleanor Shaw. "Coffee?" he offered. "Please." He poured her a mug, and they sat across from each other at the kitchen table. Beverly studied him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "You look like your father," she said at last. "Same eyes, same jaw." Martin had heard this before and had always hated it. His relationship with Bernard Shaw had been strained at best, openly hostile at worst. "I'm told I have my mother's temperament, at least." Beverly smiled thinly. "Lucky you." She sipped her coffee, then set the mug down with deliberate care. "Your mother worried about you, you know, even after all these years away. She used to say you were the smart one, getting out of King's Hollow when you did." "Mom never seemed happy here," Martin agreed. "But Dad's job kept them rooted, I guess." Beverly's expression shifted, something like fear flitting across her features. "It wasn't his job that kept Bernard Shaw in King's Hollow, Martin." "What do you mean?" She glanced toward the basement door, then back at Martin. "Have you been down there yet?" A chill ran through him. "No." "Why?" Beverly stood abruptly. "I should go. I've already said too much." "Mrs. Winters, please. If there's something I should know." "Ask around town," she interrupted. "Talk to people. You'll start to see the pattern. Kids disappearing. Accidents that make no sense. The way this place seems to feed on itself." She moved toward the door, then paused and turned back. "Your mother tried to protect you. That's why she told you to leave and never come back. But now she's gone, and..." Beverly shook her head. "Be careful, Martin. And whatever you do, don't go near the quarry," Martin finished for her. Beverly's face paled. "She warned you too, then. Good." She reached out and squeezed his arm with surprising strength. "Heed that warning, Martin, for all our sakes." And then she was gone, the front door closing behind her with a decisive click, leaving Martin alone with his cooling coffee and a growing sense that coming back to King's Hollow had been a terrible mistake. Part 2, The Descent. Martin's meeting with his mother's lawyer, a balding man named Timothy Foster who perspired profusely despite the cool temperature, revealed little he didn't already know. The house was his free and clear. There was a modest life insurance policy and some savings. The process would be straightforward. Sign here, initial there, meet with the bank next week to transfer accounts. "Your mother was very organized," Foster said, mopping his brow with a handkerchief. "Made everything simpler." Martin nodded. "That sounds like her." Foster hesitated, shuffling papers needlessly. Did she leave you anything else? Any personal effects or letters? The question seemed oddly specific. Martin thought of the note directing him to the basement but decided to keep that to himself. Just the house and its contents. Why do you ask? Foster avoided his gaze. No reason, just making sure all bases are covered. He gathered his papers into a leather portfolio and stood. If you have any questions, my office is just down the street. Though I'll be out of town this weekend, taking the grandkids to Portland. Martin left the law office with the distinct impression that Timothy Foster couldn't wait to put distance between himself and Kings Hollow, if only for a weekend. Main Street was more animated than it had been the previous night, though animated was a relative term. A few elderly people sat on benches outside the post office. A woman pushed a stroller past the hardware store. A man in overalls swept the sidewalk in front of Dooley's Tavern, which was apparently open even at 10:30 in the morning. Martin decided to walk, hoping to clear his head. The air was crisp with autumn, the trees along the sidewalk blazing with red and gold. Under different circumstances, he might have found it beautiful. But Beverly Winter's cryptic warnings and his mother's strange letter had put him on edge, making even the picturesque small-town scene seem somehow menacing. Without consciously deciding to, Martin found himself walking toward the library where his mother had worked for decades. The building was a Victorian affair with a turret and gingerbread trim, funded by some long-ago industrial baron who'd had business interests in Kings Hollow. Martin climbed the steps and pushed through the heavy oak door. The interior was hushed and dimly lit, the air heavy with the smell of old books and furniture polish. A woman in her 40s sat behind the circulation desk, reading a paperback novel. She looked up as Martin approached, irritation flickering across her face at being disturbed. "Can I help you?" she asked, not bothering to smile. "I hope so," Martin said. "I'm Martin Shaw, Eleanor Shaw's son." The woman's expression changed instantly, softening into something like pity. "Oh, Mr. Shaw, I'm so sorry for your loss. Your mother was... well, she was something of an institution here." "Thank you. And you are?" "Diana Crenshaw. I worked with your mother for 15 years. Martin hadn't expected to find someone who had known his mother well, and he seized the opportunity. "I wonder if I could ask you a few questions about her work here." Diana glanced around the empty library, then nodded. "I suppose so. What would you like to know? Did she ever mention anything unusual about Kings Hollow? Any local legends or strange occurrences?" Diana's posture stiffened. "Why do you ask?" Martin hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "She left me a letter suggesting there was something wrong with the town. Something dangerous." Diana was quiet for so long that Martin thought she might not respond. Then she sighed heavily. "Your mother was the town historian after your father died. She had access to records going back to the town's founding. Ancient town council minutes, personal journals, newspaper archives. She spent years piecing together a pattern." "What kind of pattern?" Diana lowered her voice, though there was no one else in the library to overhear. "Disappearances, deaths, particularly of children and young people. Far more than you'd expect in a town this size." She paused. "Most people chalk it up to the quarry. Kids sneaking in, falling into the water. Accidents happen, especially in rural areas with natural hazards. But your mother thought there was more to it." "What did she think was happening?" Martin asked, his mouth suddenly dry. Diana hesitated again, then reached under the desk and produced a key. "Come with me." She led him through the stacks to a door marked Historical Archives, Staff Only. The key turned in the lock with a heavy click, and Diana ushered him into a small room lined with metal shelving. Boxes and bound volumes filled the shelves, meticulously labeled by year. Diana moved to a filing cabinet in the corner and unlocked a drawer. From it, she withdrew a thick manila folder. "Your mother compiled this over years," she said, handing it to Martin. "She made me promise that if anything ever happened to her, I'd make sure you got it if you ever came back to Kings Hollow." Martin opened the folder to find newspaper clippings, photocopied journal pages, and handwritten notes, all organized chronologically. The earliest items dated back to the 1830s, just decades after Kings Hollow's founding. A yellowed newspaper clipping caught his eye. Quarry claims 3 more lives. Kings Hollow Gazette, June 18, 1923. 3 local youths, Timothy Collins, 14, Robert Fisher, 15, and William Evans, 13, are presumed drowned after failing to return from a fishing expedition near the quarry yesterday afternoon. Witnesses report seeing the boys near the water's edge shortly before a sudden downpour. This marks the 5th drowning incident at the quarry this year, prompting calls for improved safety measures. Another clipping, this one from 1956. Search for missing girl enters 3rd day. Kings Hollow Gazette, October 12, 1956. The search continues for Lucy Winfield, 12, who vanished while walking home from school on Monday. Police have focused their efforts on the abandoned quarry, a known attraction for local children despite repeated warnings from authorities. Lucy's lunchbox was discovered near the quarry fence, suggesting she may have entered the restricted area. Martin flipped through more clippings. 1891, 1905, 1934, 1967, 1979, 1993. Each detailed disappearances or deaths, most near the quarry, most involving children or teenagers. His mother had annotated the margins with precise notes. Pattern repeats approximate every 27 to 30 years, and increased activity follows seismic events, and, most disturbingly, not drownings, taken. Jesus, Martin muttered, looking up at Diana. She thought there was some kind of, what? Serial killer operating in Kings Hollow for nearly 2 centuries. Diana shook her head. Not a killer. At least not human. She lowered her voice further. Eleanor believed there was something in the quarry. Something that had been there since before the town was founded. Something that feeds on fear and youth. Under normal circumstances, Martin would have dismissed such a claim as ridiculous. But the weight of the evidence in his hands, compiled by his practical, no-nonsense mother, made it hard to brush aside. Did she have any proof? He asked. Only patterns and testimonies, Diana replied. And this. She pulled a final item from the filing cabinet, a small, leather-bound journal. This belonged to Jeremiah Kings, the town founder. He was a surveyor who discovered a rich vein of limestone here in 1801. He established the quarry operation the following year. She handed Martin the journal, open to an entry dated November 15, 1802. The men refused to continue excavation of the eastern face. They claimed to hear voices from within the stone. Peterson says he saw something moving beneath the water that has collected at the bottom. Not like any fish or frog, he insisted. I dismissed their concerns as superstition, but this morning I witnessed something troubling. The water moved in concentric circles, as if disturbed from below, yet nothing visible broke the surface. More concerning were the markings we uncovered today, circular patterns like nothing I have seen in nature, embedded in the rock face. Reverend Miller suggests they may be fossils, but they seem too deliberate, too designed. I find myself reluctant to approach the water's edge. The entry continued on the next page. Tonight I dreamed of circles within circles, spinning endlessly into darkness. A voice called from the depths, promising wealth beyond imagining if only I would bring it what it needs. The young ones, it said, bring me the young ones, with their fears still fresh and their dreams still bright. I awoke in a cold sweat, my bed sheets soaked through. I tell myself it was merely a nightmare born of the men's superstitions. Yet I cannot shake the feeling that something watches us from the quarry depths. Something ancient, something hungry. Martin closed the journal, his hands trembling slightly. This can't be real. Your father thought it was, Diana said quietly. He devoted his life to researching it. And after he died, your mother continued his work. But why? Why not just leave? Diana's expression was grim. Because whatever is in the quarry doesn't let people leave easily. Haven't you noticed how few people move away from Kings Hollow? How the population only decreases, never increases. The thing in the quarry, it has a hold on this town, on all of us who were born here. A cold realization dawned on Martin. I left. I got away. Diana nodded. Yes, and your mother made that possible. She protected you, helped you escape its influence. She glanced at her watch. I've said too much. You should take these materials, study them. And be careful, Mr. Shaw. Very careful. As Martin left the library with the folder and journal tucked under his arm, a sense of unreality washed over him. This was madness, ancient entities, cursed towns, supernatural predators. And yet the journal entries matched what he himself had seen at the quarry 30 years ago. The concentric circles on the rock face, the unnatural movement of the water, the whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, and Jerry Winters, disappearing beneath the black surface, never to be seen again. Martin walked back to the house on Prospect Hill, his mind racing. He needed to see for himself what was in the basement, what his father had hidden behind the workbench. He needed to understand what had kept his parents trapped in this town for decades, what had made his mother so desperate to ensure he escaped. As he turned onto his street, Martin noticed a figure standing in front of his house. A man in his early 40s, solidly built, with a sheriff's badge on his jacket. The man watched Martin's approach with an unreadable expression. "Martin Shaw?" The man called as Martin neared the house. "That's right." The man extended a hand. "Sheriff Mike Dufresne, Tommy's older brother." Martin shook the offered hand, memories flooding back. Mike Dufresne had been 5 years older than Martin and his friends, a high school junior when they were in middle school. He'd been there that night at the quarry. He was the one who'd first noticed the strange circles on the rock face. "Mike, good to see you." The sheriff's expression suggested the feeling wasn't mutual. "Heard you were back in town. Thought I'd stop by, pay my respects. Your mother was a good woman." "Thank you," Martin said, suddenly eager to get inside the house, away from Mike Dufresne's scrutiny. "Would you like to come in?" "No," Mike said quickly, too quickly. "I just wanted to make sure you're settling in okay, and to give you a friendly warning." "Warning?" Mike stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Kings Hollow hasn't changed much since you left, Martin. Same small town problems. Best not to go stirring up old memories or asking too many questions." The threat was thinly veiled. Martin clutched the folder from the library tighter against his side. "I'm just here to settle my mother's affairs, Mike. 2 weeks, tops." Mike studied him for a moment, then nodded. "See, that's all you do." He turned to leave, then paused. "And stay away from the quarry. That place isn't safe." "So I've been told," Martin murmured. Mike walked to his patrol car parked at the curb, called over his shoulder. "Some of us have to live here after you're gone, Shaw. Remember that." Martin watched the sheriff drive away, a sense of foreboding settling over him like the gray clouds gathering above Kings Hollow. Whatever secrets lay buried in this town, there were people who wanted them to stay buried. And Martin was starting to understand why. Part 3, The Awakening. The basement door opened with a protesting creak, revealing a set of wooden stairs descending into darkness. Martin flipped the light switch, and a single bulb illuminated the space below. Concrete floors, stone foundation walls, exposed joists overhead. His father's workbench stood against the far wall, exactly as Martin remembered it. He descended slowly, each step sending a shiver of dread through him. The basement air was cold and damp, with an underlying smell of mildew and something else, something metallic, like old pennies or blood. Martin approached the workbench, noting the layer of dust covering its surface. His father had been dead for 18 years. No one had used this space in a long time. Behind the bench, just as his mother's letter had described, was the foundation wall with its rough-hewn stones. Martin ran his hands over the stones, testing each one. Most were solidly mortared in place, but near the floor, one shifted slightly under his touch. He worked his fingers around the edges and pulled. The stone came loose, revealing a dark cavity beyond. Reaching in, his fingers touched cold metal. He withdrew a small box similar to a safety deposit box with a simple combination lock on the front. Martin stared at it, trying to think what combination his father might have used. Birthday, anniversary, some significant date? On impulse, he tried 1-8-0-2. The year King's Hollow was founded according to the sign at the edge of town. The lock clicked open. Inside the box were several leather-bound journals, similar in appearance to Jeremiah King's journal from the library but more modern. Each was labeled with years, 1975 to 1980, 1980 to 1985, and so on. Bernard Shaw's research journals. Martin took them out and opened the most recent one, covering 2000 to 2006, the years leading up to his father's death. The neat, cramped handwriting was instantly recognizable. April 17, 2001, the seismic activity has increased again, just as it did in 1973 and 1944 before that. The pattern holds. Approximately every 27 to 30 years, the earth beneath King's Hollow shifts. And with each shift, the hunger below awakens. Already there are reports of strange sounds from the quarry. Diane Miller's boy claims he heard someone calling his name when he rode his bike past the fence yesterday. It begins again. June 8, 2001, 3 children have reported hearing voices from the quarry in the past month. Sheriff Dufresne continues to dismiss my concerns, insisting that increased patrols around the perimeter are sufficient. He refuses to acknowledge the pattern, though he of all people should recognize it. His brother Tommy was there the night Jerry Winters was taken. He saw what happened. October 21st, 2001. It took Melissa Cooper's daughter last night. 10 years old. They're calling it a drowning, though no body has been recovered. I tried to warn them. I've been trying to warn this town for decades, but they don't want to hear it. They don't want to face what lives beneath King's Hollow. The entries continued, detailing more disappearances, more accidents, more attempts by Bernard Shaw to convince the townspeople that something predatory lurked in the quarry. The final entry, dated January 12, 2006, just 3 weeks before his death, was the most disturbing. I've made contact, using the incantation found in Jeremiah King's second journal, stored in library archives, section H7. I called to the entity below. It answered. God help me, it answered. It knows me, knows my bloodline. Says the king's family made a pact with it in 1802, sacrifices in exchange for prosperity. When the limestone ran out and the quarry closed in 1921, the sacrifices became harder to provide. The entity grew hungry, angry. It began taking what wasn't freely given. It wants Martin, has always wanted Martin. Something about his fear, sweeter than most, it said. I've protected him all these years by sending him away, but now it demands his return. Threatens to take Eleanor if I don't comply. Cannot lose her, but I cannot sacrifice my son, no matter how strained our relationship. There may be another way. The entity is bound to the water and stone of the quarry. If the quarry were destroyed, filled in, perhaps, or the water drained, its power might be diminished. I need to research further. Time is running short. I can feel it watching, always watching. Martin closed the journal, his hands shaking uncontrollably now. His father had died of a heart attack while alone in his study. At least that's what the death certificate had stated. But what if it wasn't natural causes? What if something had stopped him before he could act on his plan to destroy the quarry? And what did it mean that this thing, this entity, wanted Martin specifically? That his father had protected him by sending him away? Martin had always believed that his father had driven him away with criticism and emotional coldness. That his departure from King's Hollow at 18 had been an act of rebellion and self-preservation. Now he wondered if Bernard Shaw had deliberately created distance between them, had intentionally made King's Hollow inhospitable for Martin, all to protect him from the thing in the quarry. The revelation was too much to process. Martin gathered the journals and hurried back upstairs, slamming the basement door behind him. He needed air, needed to think. Outside, the day had turned gray and threatening, the earlier sunshine obscured by heavy clouds. A fitful wind sent dead leaves skittering along the sidewalk as Martin walked without clear destination, his father's journals tucked inside his jacket. Almost without realizing it, he found himself on Quarry Road, the narrow lane that led to the abandoned limestone operation that had given King's Hollow its original purpose. Warning signs lined the road: no trespassing, danger, deep water. Authorized personnel only. Martin stopped at the chain-link fence that surrounded the quarry property. From here, he could see the gash in the earth, the steep rock walls descending to dark water below. The quarry was roughly circular, perhaps 300 yards across, with sheer drops of 50 to 100 feet to the water's surface. Decades of rain and groundwater had filled the pit, creating what appeared to be a perfectly normal, if eerily still, lake. But Martin knew better now. Knew that something waited beneath that placid surface. Something old and hungry. Something that had been feeding on the children of King's Hollow for generations. "You shouldn't be here." The voice startled him. Martin turned to find Tommy Dufresne standing a few yards away, hands thrust deep in the pockets of his weathered jacket. Tommy had aged hard, his face lined and leathery, his hair more gray than brown, his eyes haunted. But Martin recognized him immediately as the boy who had once been his best friend. "Tommy," Martin acknowledged, "your brother mentioned you still lived in town." "Never left," Tommy said flatly. "Unlike some people." The accusation hung in the air between them. Martin didn't bother denying it. "I didn't know, Tommy, about any of this, about what really happened to Jerry." Tommy's expression darkened. "Bullshit. You were there. You heard it calling from the water. You saw the circles on the rock." "I was 13, Martin protested. "I didn't understand what I was seeing." "None of us did," Tommy conceded, moving closer to stand beside Martin at the fence. "Except your father. He knew. Came to my house the next day, warned my parents not to let me or Mike go near the quarry again. Said it had taken a taste of us." Tommy shuddered at the memory. "I had nightmares for years. Still do sometimes." Martin stared out at the quarry, trying to reconcile his childhood memories with what he now knew. "My father's journals say it wants me. Has always wanted me. Do you know why?" Tommy was quiet for so long that Martin thought he might not answer. Then he sighed heavily. "Your family founded this town, Martin. Not directly, the King's family did that. But Bernard Shaw's great-great-grandfather was Jeremiah King's business partner. The Shaws have always been connected to the quarry, to what lives in it." "What is it, Tommy? What's down there?" Tommy shook his head. "No one knows for sure. No one knows for sure. Your dad called it the sleeper in the deep in his research. Some folks think it's some kind of ancient creature that was trapped when they dug out the quarry. Others say it's something not from here, not from our world." Tommy's voice dropped to nearly a whisper. "All I know is it's real, and it's hungry, and it's patient." Martin thought of the concentric circles on the quarry wall. The markings, are they some kind of symbol? A language? "Your father thought they were a binding spell," Tommy replied. "Something the King's family used to control the entity, to direct its hunger toward specific targets." "Human sacrifices," Martin said flatly. Tommy nodded. "In exchange for prosperity. The limestone vein shouldn't have lasted as long as it did. The town shouldn't have thrived the way it did, even after the quarry closed. But it all came with a price. And now the town is dying," Tommy said. "The binding is weakening. The sacrifices have become irregular, harder to control. And the hunger grows." Martin turned to face his childhood friend. "Sacrifices? You mean the accidents and disappearances are still deliberate? People in town are still feeding this thing?" Tommy wouldn't meet his eyes. "Not everyone knows. Most folks genuinely believe they're accidents. Only a few families maintain the old traditions, the founding families who made the original pact." "Like the Dufresnes?" Martin asked, sudden understanding dawning. Tommy's face twisted with grief and guilt. "My brother, he's the keeper now, since your father died. He decides when and who." He looked up at Martin, tears in his eyes. "I've tried to stop it, Martin. I've tried to warn people. But no one leaves King's Hollow unless they're chosen to leave. Like you were. My father chose to send me away," Martin said. "To protect me. Yes, but now you're back." Tommy glanced nervously at the quarry. "And it knows you're here. It's been waiting for you." As if in response to Tommy's words, a low rumble rolled across the quarry. Not quite thunder, something deeper, more primal. The previously still water rippled in concentric circles, emanating from the center. "We need to go," Tommy said urgently, grabbing Martin's arm. "Now, it's waking up." They hurried back down Quarry Road toward town, the rumbling growing louder behind them. Martin clutched his father's journals tighter against his chest, his mind racing. If his father had been right, there might be a way to destroy the entity, to end its hold on King's Hollow once and for all. But first, he needed to understand the binding spell, the markings on the quarry wall, the original pact made between Jeremiah Kings and the thing in the deep. "I need to see the original journal," Martin said as they reached Main Street. "The second volume my father mentioned. It's in the library archives." Tommy looked uneasy. "The library's closed on Wednesday afternoons." "I'll find another way in," Martin insisted. "This has to end, Tommy. Whatever this thing is, however long it's been feeding on this town, it has to stop." Tommy hesitated, then nodded. "I'll help you. Tonight, after dark. Meet me behind the library at 9. As they parted ways, Martin couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced back toward the quarry, barely visible now from town, a dark shape against the horizon. For a moment, he thought he saw something, a ripple of movement, a shadow that didn't belong. Then it was gone, and Martin was left with only the cold certainty that time was running out. For him, for King's Hollow, for everyone. Part 4, The Covenant. Night fell early over King's Hollow, darkness seeping between the trees and houses like black water. Martin waited behind the library, sheltered from the cold drizzle by the building's overhang. 9 o'clock came and went with no sign of Tommy. By 9:20, Martin was considering giving up. Perhaps Tommy had lost his nerve. Or worse, perhaps someone, his brother, the sheriff, had stopped him from coming. Just as Martin turned to leave, a flashlight beam cut through the darkness. Tommy appeared around the corner of the building, his face pale and drawn in the harsh light. "Sorry I'm late," he whispered. Mike was watching the house. Had to wait for him to leave for his night patrol. Tommy produced a key ring from his pocket. "Diana gave me these years ago when I was helping your mother with her research. She'd probably be fired if anyone knew." The keys opened the library's back entrance with a soft click. They slipped inside, Tommy leading the way with his flashlight. The library was tomb quiet, their footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors despite their attempts at stealth. "Archives are this way," Tommy murmured, guiding them through the stacks to the door Martin had visited earlier with Diana. The key turned smoothly in the lock, and they entered the small room with its shelves of historical materials. Tommy went straight to a filing cabinet labeled 1800 to 1850 and began searching through folders. "Your father showed me once," he explained as he worked. "Said I needed to understand what we were dealing with in case something happened to him." He withdrew a thin, leather-bound volume similar to the one Martin had seen earlier, but smaller, more worn. "Here it is, Jeremiah King's second journal, covering 1803 to 1807. Martin took the journal reverently, aware that he was holding perhaps the only record of how the horror in King's Hollow had begun. He opened it carefully, the ancient binding crackling under his fingers. The first entries detailed mundane quarry operations, production figures, worker disputes, equipment needs. But on November 3rd, 1803, the tone changed dramatically. "I have committed an unspeakable act. May God forgive me, though I know he will not. Last night, as instructed by the voice from the deep, I led young Timothy Gravers, 12, to the quarry under pretense of showing him an unusual fossil. The boy was eager, trusting. When we reached the water's edge, the surface began to move in the now familiar circles. Timothy grew frightened and turned to run. God help me, I pushed him into the water. The boy did not drown as I expected. Instead, something pulled him under, something with too many limbs, something that moved like smoke through water. His screams lasted only moments, then silence. This morning, I found a new vein of limestone in the eastern wall, impossibly rich, exactly where the quarry had previously been barren. The voice kept its promise. Prosperity for sacrifice. Martin felt physically ill reading the account. He forced himself to continue, turning pages rapidly now, scanning for information about the binding spell his father had mentioned. He found it in an entry dated December 25th, 1804, Christmas Day. While the town celebrated the Savior's birth, I returned to the quarry to complete the ritual. Using the mixture of cinnabar, ash, and my own blood, I inscribed the 7 circles of binding upon the rock face just above the water line. The entity resisted, the water boiled and churned, and voices cried out in agony from the depths. But the ancient words held power, and gradually the waters calmed. The binding is complete. The entity is now connected to the king's bloodline, its hunger controlled by our will. It must obey the keeper of the covenant, myself, and after me, my descendants. 1 sacrifice every 7 years will maintain the binding. 1 child, freely given or deliberately chosen. The prosperity of King's Hollow is assured for generations to come. Attached to the page was a carefully drawn diagram of overlapping circles with strange symbols inscribed between them, along with a series of words in a language Martin didn't recognize. "This is it," Martin said, showing Tommy the diagram. "The binding spell. And look, instructions for strengthening it or breaking it." Tommy studied the page. Breaking it could release whatever's down there, make things worse. Or it could free the town, Martin countered. End the need for sacrifices. A noise from outside the archives room, a creak of floorboards, made them both freeze. Tommy extinguished his flashlight, plunging them into darkness. The archives door swung open. Light spilled in from a powerful flashlight, momentarily blinding them. Well, came Sheriff Mike Dufresne's voice. "Breaking and entering. That's a serious offense, gentlemen." As Martin's eyes adjusted, he could make out Mike's silhouette in the doorway, one hand holding the flashlight, the other resting on his holstered gun. "It's not what it looks like, Mike," Tommy began. "Save it," the sheriff snapped. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. His eyes fell on the open journal in Martin's hands. "I see you've been doing some light reading, following in your father's footsteps after all." Bernard Shaw's face smiled, and in that smile was nothing human at all. "No? I've been in his head, consumed his memories, his knowledge. In some ways, I know Bernard Shaw better than he knew himself." "What do you want?" Martin asked, though he already knew the answer. "To thank you," the entity said, stepping further into the room. Where it walked, the floor seemed to darken, to soften. "You and your friends released me from a prison that has held me for generations. So limiting, feeding only on what was brought to me, restricted to that stagnant pool. We were trying to destroy you," Martin said. The entity laughed, Bernard Shaw's face stretching unnaturally with the sound. "Destroy me? With a ritual invented by a desperate man to control what he could not understand?" "No, Martin. You did exactly what I've been waiting for someone to do for 200 years. It moved closer, and Martin backed away until he hit the wall behind him. The survey book felt heavy in his hands, suddenly significant in a way he hadn't expected. The entity's gaze dropped to the book.
A. Bernarès contingency plan.
Clever, but ultimately futile. Even if you collapsed every tunnel, every cave beneath King's Hollow, you cannot contain me anymore. I've tasted freedom. I've spread through the groundwater, the soil, the very air you breathe. As if to demonstrate, it raised one hand. The fingers elongated, darkened, becoming like liquid shadow, stretching toward Martin's face. "But enough talk," it said, Bernard Shaw's voice distorting, deepening. "I've waited so long to taste you, Martin. Your father kept you from me, sent you away. But now you're here, and your fear is exquisite. So much potential still untapped, so many possible futures to consume." Martin clutched the book tighter, searching desperately for a way out. The windows were behind his father's desk, but they'd been painted shut decades ago. The only exit was the doorway where the entity stood. "My father was right about you," Martin said, playing for time. "You're a parasite, predator, nothing more." The entity smiled again, wider this time, Bernard Shaw's face splitting unnaturally to reveal rows of teeth like black glass. I am far more than that, Martin. I am the hunger beneath, the patient dark, the thing that waits at the bottom of every quarry, every mine, every well. I am what you fear when you peer into deep water and something peers back. It lunged suddenly, faster than Martin could react. The shadowy fingers touched his face, cold as deep water, slick as oil. Memories flooded Martin's mind, not his own, but others. Children screaming as they were pulled beneath black water. Jerry Winters thrashing as he was consumed over days, kept conscious to maximize his fear. His father clutching his chest in agony as the entity reached through dimensions to stop his heart. And through it all, the hunger, ancient, insatiable, patient. Martin's scream tore through the house as he fought against the invasion, pushing back with everything he had. He swung the heavy survey book wildly, connecting with what had been Bernard Shaw's head. The entity hissed and recoiled, its form rippling like disturbed water. It was the opening Martin needed. He bolted for the door, shouldering past the entity, feeling a cold, wet resistance as he made contact. Down the hallway, through the kitchen, out the back door, he ran without looking back, the survey book still clutched against his chest. Outside, the sky had darkened further, the sickly yellow light giving way to a deep, unnatural twilight, though it was barely afternoon. The ground trembled continuously now, small fissures appearing with each shake. Martin ran toward Tanglewood Road, toward the convoy that might already be leaving. But as he reached Main Street, he saw that his path was blocked. A massive sinkhole had opened, swallowing half the road, cars and all. From within came that same awful laughter he'd heard at the quarry. There was only one option left. Martin changed direction, heading for the old power station at the edge of town. If his father's contingency plan had any chance of working, he had to try. He owed that much to King's Hollow, to the people already lost. To those who might still be, he owed that much to King's Hollow. To the people already lost, to those who might still be saved. The old power station loomed against the darkening sky, a brick monolith from another era. Once it had provided electricity to the quarry operation and the growing town. Now it stood abandoned, its windows broken, its iron door rusted but intact. Martin approached cautiously, survey book in hand. The ground here seemed more stable, the bedrock closer to the surface. His father's notes indicated the power station had been built on a solid foundation specifically to withstand the vibrations from quarry blasting. The iron door resisted at first, then gave way with a screech of protest. Inside, the air was stale but mercifully free of the heavy wrongness that permeated the rest of King's Hollow. Martin's flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing massive generators long silent, control panels covered in dust, cobwebs draped like funeral shrouds over abandoned equipment. According to the survey book, the cellar access should be near the main transformer. Martin found it at the back of the building, a heavy trapdoor set into the concrete floor, secured with a padlock that broke easily under the blow of a discarded wrench. The cellar stairs descended into darkness so complete it seemed to swallow his flashlight beam. Martin went down slowly, testing each step before committing his weight. At the bottom, he swept his light across the space and caught his breath. The cellar had been converted into something between an armory and a research laboratory. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books, papers, and equipment. A workbench held an array of tools and what appeared to be half-assembled explosive devices. In the center of the room stood a large table with a detailed map of King's Hollow spread across it, the tunnel network clearly marked in red ink, with 5 X's indicating the junction points his father had identified. And beside the map, a leather-bound journal much newer than the others Martin had found, its cover unmarked, its pages filled with his mother's handwriting. Martin set down the survey book and picked up the journal with trembling hands. The first entry was dated just 2 months after his father's death. I've decided to continue Bernard's work, not just documenting the entity and its effects on King's Hollow, but actively seeking a way to destroy it. The binding spell has weakened significantly since Bernard's death. His connection to the king's bloodline through his grandmother gave him a power over the entity that no one else in town possesses. Except, perhaps, Martin. But I will not drag my son back into this nightmare. He escaped. He is safe. That must be enough. Martin flipped through the journal, reading his mother's increasingly desperate entries as she documented the entity's growing influence. More disappearances, more accidents, strange behaviors among longtime residents, the inexplicable decay of buildings and land near the quarry. The final entry, dated just weeks before her death, made Martin's blood run cold. The cancer is spreading faster than Dr. Rayburn can explain. I know what's happening. It's punishing me for continuing Bernard's work, for seeking a way to destroy it. But I've made a discovery that may change everything. The entity isn't just bound to the quarry. It's bound to King's Hollow itself, to the bloodlines of the founding families. This is why no one truly leaves. Some part of them always remains connected, always vulnerable to its influence. Bernard's plan to collapse the tunnels might temporarily contain it, but not destroy it. For that, a more fundamental severing is required. The original binding used the blood of the king's family to connect the entity to this place, to these people. To break that connection permanently requires a sacrifice of that same bloodline, willing, not taken, at the moment when the entity is fully manifested. Martin is the last of both bloodlines, King's through Bernard's grandmother, Shaw through direct descent. If he were to return, if he were to offer himself willingly when the entity surfaces completely, no, I cannot contemplate this. Will not. There must be another way. The explosives are ready. I've prepared everything according to Bernard's specifications. If all else fails, at least we can buy time. Seal it away again, if not forever, then for long enough to find a permanent solution. Martin closed the journal, his mind reeling. His mother had known all along that he might be the key to ending this nightmare permanently. That his blood, the blood of both founding families, carried the power to sever the entity's connection to King's Hollow forever. But it would require his willing sacrifice at the moment when the entity was fully manifested. When it was at its most powerful, most vulnerable. A deep rumble shook the power station, dust and debris raining from the ceiling. The entity was spreading, consuming King's Hollow house by house, person by person. Soon there would be nothing left, and then it would move beyond the town limits, seeking new feeding grounds. Martin turned his attention to the explosives his parents had prepared. 5 packages, each carefully labeled with a location corresponding to the junction points on the map. His father's notes detailed exactly where and how they should be placed for maximum effect. It wasn't a permanent solution. His mother's journal made that clear. But it might buy time, might save those who had evacuated, might prevent the entity from spreading beyond King's Hollow. As Martin gathered the explosives into a canvas bag, he felt a strange calm settle over him. There was clarity in knowing what had to be done, even if the path forward was dangerous. The ground trembled again as he emerged from the power station. The sky had darkened to an unnatural night, though Martin's watch showed it was only mid-afternoon. In the direction of town, he could see flashes of that eerie blue-green light, pulsing like a heartbeat. Martin consulted the survey book, plotting the fastest route to the first junction point, beneath the old mill at the edge of town. He would work his way inward, setting charges at each location, saving the most central junction for last. As he moved through the dying town, Martin became aware of shapes in the darkness. Not just collapsed buildings and opened earth, but something else. Figures that moved with unnatural fluidity, that seemed to melt into shadows and reform elsewhere. The entity was manifesting physically now, extending its presence above ground. The first junction point was accessible through the mill's basement, down a maintenance shaft that connected to the tunnel network. Martin descended cautiously, the smell of damp earth and something else, something rotten and ancient, growing stronger with every step. The tunnel was roughly hewn limestone, water dripping from the ceiling, the walls slick with moisture. Martin's flashlight revealed the junction ahead, a spot where 5 separate tunnels converged into a natural chamber about 20 feet in diameter. According to his father's notes, the explosive needed to be placed at the center of the chamber's ceiling, where the rock was thinnest. Martin worked quickly, securing the package in place, setting the timer for 30 minutes, enough time to reach the next junction and move a safe distance away before detonation. He was turning to leave when he heard it, a sound like water flowing, but wrong somehow, too deliberate, too directed. Martin swung his flashlight toward the noise. One of the tunnels was filling with a black, viscous substance that moved against gravity, flowing uphill toward the junction. Within it, shapes formed and dissolved, faces Martin recognized from town, their expressions frozen in terror. The entity had found him. Martin ran, scrambling back up the maintenance shaft, the sounds of pursuit liquid and obscene behind him. He emerged into the mill basement just as something cold and wet wrapped around his ankle. He kicked free, feeling his shoe pulled off in the process, and kept moving. Outside, King's Hollow was transforming. The ground rippled like the surface of a pond, buildings sinking and rising in waves. The air itself seemed to pulse with malevolent awareness. And everywhere, that black substance spread up from the ground, down from what had once been the sky, consuming everything it touched. Martin checked the survey book, plotting a course to the next junction point. He had to keep moving, had to place all 5 charges. It was the only chance to contain this thing, even temporarily. The second junction lay beneath the old church at the center of town. The third beneath the school. The fourth beneath the library. Martin moved from site to site, setting charges, always just ahead of the spreading blackness, the pursuing entity. By the time he reached the final junction, beneath the town square, King's Hollow was barely recognizable. The entity had consumed most of the physical structures, reshaping them into grotesque approximations that pulsed and shifted like organs in some vast, unknowable body. This last junction was the largest, a cathedral-like cavern where all the primary tunnels ultimately converged. Here, according to his father's notes, was where the entity had first been discovered, where Jeremiah Kings had made his terrible pact. Martin descended through what had once been the town hall, now just a shell filled with writhing darkness. The tunnel entrance was almost completely blocked with the black substance, but Martin forced his way through, feeling it cling to his clothes, try to seep into his mouth and nose. The cavern beyond was vast, the ceiling lost in darkness, the walls lined with those same concentric circles he had seen at the quarry. But here they covered every surface, thousands upon thousands of them, overlapping, interconnected. And at the center of the cavern floor, a pool of absolute blackness that reflected nothing, that seemed to draw light into itself and extinguish it. As Martin approached with the final explosive, the pool began to move. It rose up, forming a column similar to what they had seen at the quarry but larger, more defined. The shape it took was human-like but wrong, too many limbs, too fluid, its features constantly shifting between faces Martin recognized. His father, Jerry Winters, Beverly, his mother. "You think these toys can stop me?" The voice was a chorus of everyone the entity had consumed, echoing through the cavern. "I am beyond such physical constraints now. I have taken King's Hollow. Soon I will take everything." Martin set the final charge, his hands steady despite his fear. "Not if I can help it." The entity laughed, the sound like stones grinding together. "Brave Martin Shaw, last of the bloodlines. Do you know how long I've waited for you? How I've hungered for you specifically?" It moved closer, the faces within it pressing outward as if struggling to break free. "Your father kept you from me. Your mother died to protect you. But here you are at last, delivering yourself to me willingly." Willingly. The word triggered something in Martin's memory, his mother's journal, her discovery about severing the entity's connection to King's Hollow permanently. It required a sacrifice of the combined bloodlines, willing, not taken, at the moment when the entity was fully manifested. And looking at the writhing column of darkness before him, Martin knew that moment had arrived. The entity had consumed enough of King's Hollow, enough of its people, to manifest completely. It was as vulnerable now as it would ever be. Martin straightened, facing the entity directly. "You're right. I am here willingly. I've set the charges, but I know they won't destroy you. Nothing so simple could." The entity's movements stilled slightly, a hint of wariness entering its collective voice. "What game are you playing, Martin Shaw?" "No game," Martin said, stepping closer to the black pool at the entity's base. An ending. His mother's notes had not specified exactly what kind of sacrifice was required, only that it be willing, not taken by force. Martin hoped his blood alone might be enough. He drew his pocket knife and sliced his palm, letting the blood drip into the black pool. "I offer myself freely," he said, the words coming to him as if from some ancient memory not his own. "Blood of kings, blood of Shah, to break the covenant made by my ancestors, to sever your connection to this place, to these people, forever." The entity shrieked, a sound of rage and sudden fear. The black column writhed violently, the faces within it contorting in agony. "No, you cannot. The covenant is eternal. The hunger is eternal." But something was happening. Where Martin's blood touched the blackness, it began to change, to lighten, to dissolve. The effect spread outward, the entity's substance becoming less solid, more transparent. "What have you done?" it wailed, its many voices fragmenting, losing cohesion. Martin felt a strange power flowing through him, as if generations of his ancestors were lending him their strength. "What my father couldn't do, what my mother died trying to accomplish. I'm sending you back to whatever hell you came from." The entity lunged for him in desperation, but its substance passed through Martin harmlessly, unable to touch him now. The severing had begun, the connection between the entity and King's Hollow breaking strand by strand. Martin backed away, watching as the entity thrashed and howled, its form dissipating like smoke in strong wind. He needed to get out now, to reach safety before the charges detonated and brought the entire tunnel network down. He turned and ran, following the path he had taken down, hearing the entity's death throes echo behind him. The black substance that had filled the tunnels was receding, evaporating as the entity's hold on King's Hollow weakened. Martin emerged into what remained of the town square just as the first explosion rocked the ground beneath him. He staggered, nearly falling, as the second and third charges detonated in rapid succession. The fourth and fifth explosions came as Martin reached the edge of town, the shockwaves throwing him forward onto the road. Behind him, King's Hollow collapsed in on itself, buildings, roads, and land all sinking into the vast cavity created by the destruction of the tunnel network. Martin lay on the road, watching as the town where he was born, the town that had haunted him for 30 years, disappeared into the earth. The unnatural darkness was lifting, normal twilight taking its place. The air felt lighter, cleaner. A vehicle approached from further up the road, a pickup truck moving cautiously. It stopped beside Martin, and Tommy Dufresne leaned out the window, his face pale with shock. "Martin? Jesus Christ, what happened? The whole town just collapsed?" Martin finished for him, getting unsteadily to his feet. The tunnels gave way. He didn't try to explain the rest, about his blood, about the severing, about the entity's final moments. There would be time for that later if anyone would believe him. "The others?" he asked instead. "The people we evacuated?" "Safe," Tommy confirmed. "About 2 miles up, at the ridge crossroads. We felt the explosions, saw the..." He trailed off, staring past Martin at where King's Hollow had been. "It's really gone. All of it." Martin nodded, climbing into the truck beside Tommy. "Yes, and whatever was beneath it, that's gone too." As they drove away, Martin looked back one last time. Where King's Hollow had stood for over 2 centuries, there was now only a vast depression in the earth, like a wound that would take centuries to heal. But heal it would. Without the entity's constant hunger, without the covenant made in blood and fear, the land might recover. Nature would reclaim it, and the survivors of King's Hollow would build new lives elsewhere, free from the thing that had fed on them for generations. Martin touched the scar forming on his palm, feeling a strange mixture of grief and relief. His parents had spent their lives trying to understand and contain the horror beneath King's Hollow. They had died in that fight, but they had also protected him, prepared him, made his final act possible. The darkness behind them receded as Tommy's truck climbed the ridge road. Ahead, normal stars were appearing in the evening sky. Martin looked up at them and, For the first time since returning to King's Hollow, felt like he could breathe freely. Whatever nightmares might follow, whatever memories might haunt him, he had broken the covenant. He had ended the hunger beneath. King's Hollow was gone, but its people, those who remained, were finally free. As was he. Epilogue echoes. 1 year later, Martin stood at the observation point on Highway 17, looking down at what had once been King's Hollow. The massive depression in the earth had partially filled with water from underground springs, creating a lake where a town had once stood. Nothing remained visible of the buildings, the streets, the lives that had been lived there. Nature was already reclaiming the edges, wild grasses and saplings taking root in the disturbed soil. The government investigation had concluded that abandoned mining tunnels were to blame for the King's Hollow incident. No mention was made of the 37 people still unaccounted for, presumed to have been in town when it collapsed. No explanation was offered for the strange phenomena reported by survivors, the darkness, the voices, the black substance that moved with purpose. Some stories were too strange for official reports. Tommy joined Martin at the railing, handing him a cup of coffee from the thermos he'd brought. "Anniversary's always the hardest," he said quietly. Martin nodded. After the collapse, Tommy had settled in Portland, using his construction skills to find work, rebuilding homes damaged in the recent floods. Martin had stayed close by, drawn repeatedly back to this observation point, watching the lake that now covered his hometown. "Any dreams lately?" Tommy asked, the question casual but his expression concerned. Martin shook his head. "Not for a couple of months now. The nightmares had been intense at first, images of black water, of faces pressing from within darkness, of concentric circles that pulled the eye inward to madness. But they had faded with time, with distance." "That's good," Tommy said with obvious relief. "Mine too. Almost gone." They stood in companionable silence, sipping coffee, watching the morning mist rise from the lake's surface. Birds called from the trees nearby, normal sounds, natural sounds, nothing like the alien keening that had filled King's Hollow in its final hours. "Do you think it's really over?" Tommy asked finally. "Really gone?" Martin touched the scar on his palm unconsciously. "Yes," he said with quiet certainty. "The covenant is broken. The hunger is gone." Tommy seemed to accept this, nodding slowly. "Some of the others want to have a memorial service. Next month. For everyone we lost. Would you come?" Martin considered this, looking out at the peaceful lake. So many ghosts beneath that water, not just those taken in the final collapse, but all the children over generations who had disappeared into the quarry. All the sacrifices, willing and unwilling, that had fed the entity's eternal hunger. "Yes," he said finally. "I'll be there." As they turned to leave, Martin cast one final glance at the lake. For just a moment, a trick of the light, surely. He thought he saw concentric circles forming on the water's surface, rippling outward from the center like a stone had been dropped there. Then the breeze picked up, disturbing the surface, and the circles were gone. Martin walked back to the car with Tommy, leaving King's Hollow and its hungry depths behind. Some things were better left buried, left to fade into legend and then into forgotten history. And if sometimes, in the deepest part of night, he thought he heard whispers calling his name, well, that was just the wind in the trees. Nothing more. Nothing hungry. Nothing waiting. Nothing beneath. At least, that's what Martin told himself as he drove away. The lake receding in his rearview mirror, the scar on his palm tingling with phantom pain, the taste of deep water lingering at the back of his throat. Just a memory, just an echo, nothing more. The end. The Deep Below. Part 1, Homecoming. Frank Hadley had always known he would die in Millwater. It wasn't a premonition or anything mystical like that, just the resigned acceptance of a man who recognized the gravitational pull of small towns. They sucked you back eventually, no matter how far you traveled. He'd escaped once before, 23 years ago, vowing never to return to the fading lumber town nestled in the shadow of Maine's Baxter State Park. But here he was, steering his Subaru down Main Street on a drizzly October afternoon, the sky the color of wet cement. The town looked smaller than he remembered. The storefronts seemed compressed, as if mill water itself had exhaled and never quite filled its lungs again. Hadley's Market was now a vape shop. The old movie theater had become a decrepit community center with peeling paint. Only Dooley's Diner appeared unchanged, its neon sign flickering weakly against the gloom. Frank checked his watch. 4:17 p.m. He'd promised Martha he'd be at the funeral home by 5 to go over final arrangements for their father. He hadn't seen his sister in almost a decade, not since their mother's funeral. Back then, Martha had begged him to stay, to help with their increasingly erratic father. Frank had declined, citing his job in Boston, his life elsewhere. The truth was simpler and far more cowardly. He couldn't bear to be in Millwater, not after what happened, not after Jeremy. He pulled into the parking lot of the Pine Valley Motel, a single-story horseshoe of rooms that had been weathered to the exact color of despair. The vacancy sign buzzed anxiously, missing the letter C. The rain was falling harder now, heavy enough that Frank had to dash from his car to the office, his leather jacket pulled over his head. The motel clerk was ancient and disinterested, his eyes barely lifting from a dog-eared paperback as Frank checked in. Room 17. The key was attached to a plastic fob so large it barely fit in his pocket. "How long you staying?" the clerk asked, his voice like gravel in a dryer. "Not sure yet. Few days at least." Frank signed the registration card. "Just in town for a funeral." The clerk nodded as if this was the only sensible reason anyone ever came to Millwater anymore. "Harold Hadley?" he asked. Frank nodded. "Heard about that. Nasty business." The clerk turned back to his book. "Sorry for your loss." Frank muttered thanks and went back into the rain, wondering what the old man meant by nasty business. His sister had only told him that their father had died suddenly. "Heart attack," she'd said on the phone, her voice flat with exhaustion or something deeper. Room 17 smelled of industrial cleaner and cigarettes, though the room claimed to be non-smoking. The bedspread was a faded floral pattern that might have been cheerful during the Carter administration. Frank dropped his duffel bag on the floor and sat on the bed, feeling the spring's protest beneath him. He considered calling Martha to let her know he'd arrived, but found himself dialing another number instead. He wasn't sure why. Some reflexive need for comfort, perhaps, or just the desperate desire to hear something familiar in this town where everything was simultaneously strange and suffocatingly recognizable. Boston Detective Division, Detective Reynolds speaking. "Hey Mike, it's Frank." There was a pause on the line. "Frankie, you in Maine?" "Yeah, just got into town." "How's it looking?" "Like someone drained all the color out of the world." Frank stared out the window at the rain-slicked parking lot. "Town's dying. Maybe already dead." "Well, you're only there to bury your old man and sort his affairs, right?" "Week, tops. That's the plan." Reynolds sighed on the other end. Frank could picture him at his desk, pinching the bridge of his nose the way he did when he was concerned. They'd been partners for 7 years before Frank had transferred to homicide 2 years ago, and there was still a certain telepathy between them. "You sure about this, Frank? After what happened last time you were up there?" "That was a lifetime ago," Frank interrupted, more sharply than he'd intended. "And your dad passing like that, it's got to bring up memories." Frank's breath caught in his throat. "What do you mean, like that?" Another pause. "Your sister didn't tell you?" "Tell me what?" "She said it was a heart attack." Reynolds cleared his throat. "Look, maybe you should talk to her first." "Mike, tell me." There was a long sigh on the other end. "It hit the wire because of the circumstances. Your dad. They found him in the basement of your old house. His heart gave out, but..." Reynolds paused. He'd apparently been digging, for days, maybe weeks, tore up the entire concrete floor. Neighbors called it in when the smell started. They thought maybe a sewage pipe had burst. Frank's mouth went dry. Digging? For what? No one seems to know. The report just said he'd excavated almost the entire basement floor, 6 feet deep in some places. They found him at the bottom of one of the holes. Frank closed his eyes, a memory bubbling up from the depths of his consciousness. His father in rubber boots, standing in muddy water up to his shins, the flashlight beam dancing across wet stone walls. The smell of earth and something else. Something old. This is where it comes from, Frankie. This is where the bad things rise. Frank? You still there? He snapped back to the present. Yeah, I'm here. Look, I probably shouldn't have told you that. Your sister probably wanted to break it to you gently. It's fine, Frank said, though it wasn't. Nothing about this was fine. I should get going. I'm supposed to meet Martha at the funeral home. Call me if you need anything. And Frank, don't stay there too long. Frank hung up and sat motionless on the bed, listening to the rain beat against the window. The rhythmic tapping reminded him of fingernails. Small, desperate fingernails, scraping against the inside of a wooden box buried in the earth. The Pine Grove Funeral Home occupied what had once been the town's grandest Victorian mansion, its gabled roof and wraparound porch now sagging slightly, like a once beautiful woman who had given up on appearances. Frank parked next to a silver Honda he assumed was Martha's and sat for a moment, gathering himself. His conversation with Reynolds had left him unsettled. Why would their father tear up the basement floor? Harold Hadley had been many things. Stern, distant, occasionally cruel, but never irrational. Even in his drinking days, he had maintained a cold, calculating logic that had made his anger all the more terrifying. Frank couldn't imagine him engaged in some manic excavation project. Unless Frank pushed the thought away. The incident at the lake had nothing to do with this. Couldn't. That had been almost 30 years ago. Martha was waiting in the funeral home's hushed reception area, seated in a high-backed chair that made her look small and frail. She'd aged more than Frank had expected. Her brown hair now streaked with gray, crow's feet etched deeply around her eyes. But when she stood to embrace him, he caught a glimpse of the little sister who used to trail him through the woods, collecting interesting rocks and feathers. "You look good, Frankie," she said, though her eyes told a different story. She looked him over like she was checking for injuries. "You too, Marty." He used her childhood nickname automatically and was rewarded with a faint smile. "I'm sorry about Dad." Her smile vanished. "Are you?" The question caught him off guard. "Of course I am." Martha studied him for a moment, then nodded slightly, as if confirming something to herself. "Mr. Peabody is waiting for us in his office. He's handling the arrangements." The funeral director was a thin man with papery skin and unnaturally black hair. He offered Frank condolences in a practiced murmur, then guided them through burial options with the efficient detachment of someone discussing menu selections. Frank let Martha take the lead, noting how she seemed to have already decided most of the details. Closed casket. No viewing. Simple service. Dad left specific instructions, she explained when Frank questioned the rush timeline. He wanted to be buried as quickly as possible. She wouldn't meet his eyes when she said this. When they'd finished with Peabody, Martha suggested they get dinner at Dooley's. Frank followed her car through the rain-slick streets, his windshield wipers beating a metronomic rhythm that matched his growing unease. Something wasn't right. Reynolds' revelation about the basement, Martha's strange behavior, the hurried funeral arrangements. Dooley's was nearly empty, just a couple of old-timers nursing coffees at the counter and a waitress who looked bored enough to cry. The siblings slid into a booth by the window, the vinyl seats squeaking beneath them. Frank studied the laminated menu without seeing it, waiting for Martha to speak first. "You should have come back sooner," she finally said, not looking up from her menu. "Before he got bad." "I didn't know he was sick," Martha snorted. "He wasn't sick. Not physically." The waitress appeared, pouring coffee they hadn't asked for and taking their orders with mechanical efficiency. When she left, Frank leaned across the table. "What happened, Martha? What was he doing in the basement?" His sister's face went blank, a defensive mechanism he recognized from childhood. She'd always retreated into herself when things got too intense, disappearing like a turtle into its shell. "Did Mike Reynolds call you?" she asked. "He mentioned something about Dad digging up the basement floor. Why would he do that?" Martha's hands trembled slightly as she stirred sugar into her coffee. It started about 3 months ago, after the dreams. Dreams? He said he kept dreaming about Jeremy, about the lake, about what we... She stopped abruptly as the waitress returned with their food. Frank felt his appetite vanish at the mention of Jeremy's name. He picked at his meatloaf as Martha continued, her voice barely above a whisper. He said Jeremy was talking to him in the dreams, telling him things about what's underneath the house. Frank's fork froze halfway to his mouth. That's crazy. Is it? Martha's eyes met his, and he was startled by the intensity he saw there. You know what this town is built on? What Dad used to tell us about the water table, the underground streams. Those were just stories, to keep us away from the lake. Were they? Martha pushed her plate away. Then why did Jeremy want to go there so badly? Why did he make us promise to take him? Frank felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the precursor to panic he'd grown accustomed to whenever Jeremy Wilcox entered his thoughts. His childhood best friend, his first true confidant, the boy who had disappeared beneath the dark waters of Lake Millwater while Frank and Martha watched from the shore, paralyzed with horror. That was an accident, Frank said, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. Martha's laugh was bitter and short. That's what we told ourselves. That's what Dad made us tell the police. But you know better, Frankie. You know what we saw pull him under. Frank pushed his own plate away and lowered his voice. We were kids, Martha, 10 and 8 years old. We were scared and confused, and we made up a story to make sense of a terrible accident. Then explain to me why Dad spent the last months of his life digging up the basement. Explain why he kept talking about paths and doorways beneath the house. Explain this. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth, sliding it across the table. Frank unwrapped it carefully. It was a stone, not much larger than a golf ball, dark gray with faint blue veins running through it, perfectly round, as if shaped by tools rather than nature. Where did you find this? He asked, his throat suddenly dry. Dad had dozens of them. He was arranging them in patterns on the basement floor before he started digging. He said they're markers, that they show where the thin places are. Frank rewrapped the stone, trying to ignore the way it seemed to pulse against his palm, as if containing a faint heartbeat. He'd seen stones like this before. When they were children, they used to find them along the shore of Lake Millwater. Jeremy had been fascinated by them, collecting them in a cigar box under his bed. This doesn't mean anything, Frank insisted, pushing the stone back toward Martha. Dad was old. Maybe he was developing dementia. The doctors checked. His mind was fine. Martha tucked the stone back into her purse. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was trying to close something, Frankie. Something he said we opened 30 years ago when we took Jeremy to the lake. Frank felt the coffee turning acidic in his stomach. Outside, the rain had intensified, drumming against the diner's windows like impatient fingers. Why are you telling me this? What do you want from me? Martha's eyes brimmed with tears. Because it's not over. Whatever Dad was trying to do, he didn't finish it. And now Jeremy is in my dreams too. Part 2. Beneath. Frank spent a restless night at the Pine Valley Motel, drifting in and out of consciousness as the rain beat a steady rhythm against the roof. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw Jeremy Wilcox's face. Not as he'd looked that final day at the lake, but as he'd appeared in the weeks before, growing increasingly obsessed with the stories about what lurked beneath Millwater. There's a whole world down there, Frankie, Jeremy had whispered during one of their campouts in Frank's backyard. My grandpa says the Indians knew about it. That's why they never settled here. They said there were doors under the water that led to the hollow places. Frank had dismissed it as one of Jeremy's many flights of fancy. His friend had always been imaginative, always seeking magic in the mundane world. But then Jeremy had shown him the stones, perfectly round, unnaturally smooth, and something had stirred in Frank, a recognition of wrongness that his 10-year-old mind couldn't articulate. He awoke at dawn, sweat-soaked and gasping. For a disorienting moment, he thought he was back in his childhood bedroom, the one that overlooked the backyard and the dense woods beyond. But the cheap motel art on the wall and the buzzing fluorescent light in the bathroom grounded him in the present. Frank showered, letting the hot water sluice away the night's unease. He had promised Martha he would meet her at their father's house this morning to begin the overwhelming task of sorting through Harold Hadley's possessions. The funeral was scheduled for tomorrow afternoon, unusually quick, as Martha had arranged everything before Frank's arrival. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained overcast as Frank drove through town toward the outskirts where the Hadley family home stood on 2 acres of wooded land. The house came into view as he rounded the final bend. A 2-story colonial with white clapboard siding that had grayed with age and neglect. The sight of it sent a jolt of recognition through him. Not nostalgia, but something more primal. A warning. Martha's Honda was already in the driveway. Frank parked behind it and sat for a moment, steeling himself. He hadn't set foot in this house since the day after his high school graduation, when he'd packed a duffel bag and caught a Greyhound bus to Portland without saying goodbye. The front door was unlocked. Frank stepped into the foyer, assaulted immediately by the familiar smell old wood, the faint mustiness of a house built too close to water, and underneath it all, the chemical sting of the industrial cleaners his father had always used. Harold Hadley had been fanatical about cleanliness, scrubbing surfaces raw as if trying to sanitize more than just the physical space. "Martha," Frank called. "Down here." Her voice floated up from below, and Frank felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The basement. He moved through the house, noting how little had changed. The same faded wallpaper in the hallway. The same worn carpet on the stairs. The same family photos arranged on the wall, though he noticed his own face appeared only in the oldest ones, before he'd turned 11. Before Jeremy. The basement door stood open, a rectangle of absolute darkness that seemed to breathe. Frank hesitated at the threshold, a childhood terror gripping him. His father had rarely allowed them in the basement, claiming it was unsafe. On the few occasions they had ventured down, Harold had watched them with an intensity that bordered on mania, hurrying them back upstairs after only minutes. "Martha?" he called again, his voice catching. "You need to see this, Frankie." He found the light switch and flipped it on. A single bare bulb illuminated the staircase, casting more shadows than light. Frank descended slowly, the wooden steps creaking beneath his weight. The basement opened up before him, and he stopped short, breath catching in his throat. It was completely transformed from the space he remembered. The concrete floor had been demolished, exposing the earth beneath. Trenches crisscrossed the room, some shallow, others deep enough that he couldn't see the bottom in the dim light. The walls were marked with strange symbols drawn in what looked like charcoal. Concentric circles, spirals, and more complex patterns that hurt his eyes if he looked at them too long. Martha stood in the center of the chaos, her small frame dwarfed by the destruction around her. She wore rubber boots and work gloves, looking bizarrely prepared, as if she'd been expecting this. "Jesus Christ," Frank breathed, carefully picking his way toward her. "Dad did all this?" He started in the corner over there. Martha pointed to the far side of the basement, where a small hole had expanded into a massive excavation. Said he could hear water running below, that it was talking to him. Frank peered into the nearest trench. The earth was dark and moist, unlike the dry, sandy soil that characterized most of Millwater. It reminded him of the lakeshore mud, black and oddly iridescent when the light hit it just right. What was he looking for? Martha crouched down, running her gloved hand along the edge of the trench. He said there was something underneath the house. Passageway. He believed it connected to the lake. "That's impossible. The lake is 3 miles from here." "Is it?" Martha's voice had taken on a strange, dreamy quality. "Distance works differently below. That's what Jeremy used to say." Frank felt his patience fraying. Jeremy was a kid with an overactive imagination. Dad was an old man who might have been losing his mind. "None of this is real, Martha." She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the weak light like a nocturnal animal's. "Then how do you explain that?" She pointed to the deepest hole, the one where their father had reportedly been found. Frank approached it cautiously. The pit was at least 7 feet deep, its sides shored up with pieces of broken furniture and wooden boards. At the bottom, barely visible in the shadows, was a dark circular opening about 3 feet in diameter. Water gleamed at its edge. Frank felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. Is that a tunnel? Martha nodded. Dad broke through 3 days before he died. He was down there for hours that night. When he came back up, he was different, calm, like he'd found what he was looking for. She paused, pulling something from her pocket. He gave me this when he came up, said I should give it to you when you arrived. She handed Frank a small leather pouch. Inside was another of the round stones, identical to the one she'd shown him at the diner, except this one was warm to the touch, as if it had been sitting in the sun despite the basement's chill. He found it in the tunnel? Martha nodded. He said it was Jeremy's. That Jeremy wanted you to have it back. Frank nearly dropped the stone. That's insane. Is it? Martha's voice was soft. Do you remember what Jeremy said about these stones? How they were keys? Frank did remember. It had been their last conversation before that day at the lake. Jeremy had shown them his collection of stones, arranging them in a circle on his bedroom floor. My grandpa says they're keys to the hollow places, he'd whispered. If you have one, you can find your way back from the below. But you have to be careful. Sometimes things from below follow the stones back up. An image flashed in Frank's mind. Jeremy standing waist-deep in Lake Millwater, arranging stones in a circle on a submerged rock shelf. The water around him had been perfectly still, unnatural in its stillness, as if something beneath was holding its breath. This doesn't mean anything, Frank insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. These are just rocks, lake stones, rounded by water over time. Then why are they all exactly the same size? Why do they feel warm? Martha challenged. And why did Dad find one that Jeremy had? The one with the chip on one side, the one he always carried in his pocket. Frank examined the stone more closely and felt his blood run cold. There it was, a small half-moon chip on the otherwise perfect surface. He'd watched Jeremy make that mark himself, using his pocket knife to personalize his favorite stone. This could be any similar stone, Frank said weakly. Dad started digging the day after Jeremy first appeared in his dreams, Martha continued, ignoring his protest. He said Jeremy was underwater, trying to show him something important, a way to seal the path between here and below. She gestured to the charcoal symbols on the walls. These are part of it. A barrier, but it's not complete. Frank felt lightheaded. The basement suddenly too hot, too close. The smell was stronger near the hole. Not just damp earth, but something organic and wrong, like meat left too long in the sun. I need some air, he mumbled, stumbling toward the stairs. Outside, Frank leaned against his car, gulping the cool morning air. His hand was still clenched around Jeremy's stone, the impossible stone that couldn't exist. His rational mind scrambled for explanations. His father could have kept it all these years, or found another stone and damaged it in the same way to support his delusion. But deep down, in a place he'd spent decades trying to silence, Frank knew. He knew because he remembered what had happened after Jeremy placed the stones in the water. How the lake's surface had begun to ripple, though there was no wind. How the water around Jeremy had darkened, as if a shadow was rising from below. And he remembered what Jeremy had said. Just before pale, elongated fingers had wrapped around his ankles and pulled him under. It's okay, Frankie. They just want to show me the hollow places. I'll come back. I promise. Martha emerged from the house, her face grim but determined. We need to finish what Dad started, she said without preamble. We need to seal the passage. This is crazy, Frank protested. We need to call someone, the police and tell them what? That our childhood friend who drowned 30 years ago is somehow communicating from beneath the house? That there's an underwater tunnel connecting our basement to a lake 3 miles away? She shook her head. They'll think we're as crazy as everyone thought Dad was. So what's your plan? Perform some ritual you think Dad figured out from his dreams. Not just his dreams. Martha reached into her coat and pulled out a small, leather-bound journal. He kept notes, detailed ones, about the symbols, the arrangement of the stones. Everything Jeremy told him. Frank took the journal with reluctance. The pages were filled with his father's precise handwriting, diagrams of the basement with measurements and calculations, drawings of the symbols now adorning the walls, and lists, endless lists of dates, times, and cryptic observations. October 2nd, water rising. Jay says more stones needed. Pattern incomplete. October 7th, broke through to first chamber. Water black. Smells like the lake. October 12th, Jay showed me the gap. Need 13 stones in the primary circle. Inner barriers failing. Frank flipped through the pages with increasing dread. The entries grew more frantic toward the end, his father's handwriting deteriorating into a desperate scrawl. October 17th. They know I'm trying to close it. Jay says hurry. Says they are aware now. Says when water rises in basement, they are testing boundaries. October 18th, found where it comes through. Need F's help. Jay says only F can place final stone. Blood connection required. The final entry, dated just 3 days ago, consisted of a single line. Frank must come home before the water rises. This is a product of a disturbed mind, Frank said, closing the journal. But even as he spoke, doubt crept in. The detailed drawings, the consistent internal logic of the notes, it didn't read like delusion. It read like research. He died trying to protect this town, Martha said quietly, to fix what we broke when we helped Jeremy open the door. We were children. We didn't know what we were doing. Exactly. But now we do. Martha took the journal back. Dad got through most of it. The symbols, the primary stone circle. He just couldn't complete the final barrier. That's where you come in. Why me? Because you were closest to Jeremy. Because you made a promise. Frank flinched. The promise. The one he'd tried so hard to forget. The night before they went to the lake, Jeremy had made them swear a blood oath. An actual cutting of palms and pressing them together in the melodramatic way of children who've watched too many movies. Promise you'll come for me if I get lost, Jeremy had said, his eyes fever-bright in the flashlight beam. Promise you'll help me close the door if they try to come through. They'd promised, of course. What child wouldn't? It had seemed like just another of Jeremy's games. His endless fascination with the macabre given form through childish ritual. But now, standing in the shadow of his childhood home with Jeremy's stone burning in his pocket, Frank wasn't so sure. One night, he found himself saying, we'll try your ritual tonight. If nothing happens, we call the authorities. Tell them Dad had some kind of breakdown and let them deal with. He gestured toward the house. All this, Martha nodded, relief washing over her face. There's more to show you. Dad's research. The connections he found between the old mining tunnels and the lake system. The town records about the thin places. Frank followed her back into the house, Jeremy's stone still clutched in his hand. It seemed warmer now, almost vibrating with a subtle energy that made his fingertips tingle. He told himself it was just his imagination, just the power of suggestion working on a mind already primed by childhood terror and adult grief. But as they passed through the kitchen, he glimpsed something through the window that made his blood freeze. A figure standing at the edge of the woods behind the house. A slender boy in outdated clothes, his form oddly indistinct, as if viewed through water. By the time Frank blinked, the figure was gone. But the message had been received. Jeremy was waiting, Part 3 rising. They spent the day preparing. Martha had already gathered most of what they needed. Candles, salt, more of the rounded stones their father had collected. Frank found himself falling into the work with a grim determination that surprised him. He chalked it up to grief, to the need for closure, but in his heart, he knew it was fear driving him. Fear of what might happen if they didn't try. As Martha outlined their father's plan, Frank was struck by the underlying logic of it all. Harold Hadley had been methodical, tracing the history of Millwater's strange occurrences back through newspaper archives and town records. He'd found patterns, disappearances, floods, patches of inexplicable blight. all centered around the lake and occurring in roughly 30-year cycles. The last major incident before Jeremy was in 1953, Martha explained, spreading out photocopied newspaper clippings on the kitchen table. 3 children vanished while ice skating. Their bodies were never recovered. Frank studied the yellowed photograph. Police and volunteers with grim faces gathered at the lake's edge. Something about their expressions disturbed him. Not just grief, but a deeper knowledge, as if they'd been expecting this. And before that, 1922, a fisherman reported seeing hands reaching up through the ice. He tried to tell others, but no one believed him. 2 weeks later, his boat was found drifting empty on the lake. The timeline continued backward. 1891, 1860, 1,829. Incidents of drowning, disappearance, or strange behavior tied to the lake. Always separated by about 30 years. Always involving water. Always featuring reports of unusual phenomena dismissed as hysteria or hallucination. Dad believed the cycle was accelerating, Martha said, pointing to more recent entries in their father's journal. That whatever comes through is getting stronger, making the barrier thinner each time. And Jeremy? Martha's face softened. Dad thought Jeremy was caught between here and there, not fully taken but not able to return either. Caught at the threshold because of the stones he was carrying. Frank remembered the circular arrangement Jeremy had made in the shallows of the lake. 12 stones placed in a perfect circle on a submerged rock shelf. He was trying to open a door, Frank murmured, and he succeeded. Martha's voice was barely audible, but he wasn't prepared for what came through when he did. The memory surged unbidden. The water around Jeremy's waist suddenly darkening, as if ink were spreading beneath the surface. The unnatural stillness of the air. The look of surprise, then terror, then, most disturbing of all, wonder on Jeremy's face as pale, elongated fingers wrapped around his ankles. The sound of his voice, oddly calm, saying those final words before he was pulled under. "I'll come back, I promise." Frank pushed the memory away. So Dad believed we could close this door with the same kind of stone circle Jeremy used to open it. Not exactly the same. A reversal. 13 stones instead of 12. Placed in the basement rather than the lake. The symbols on the walls are part of it too. A boundary of some kind. And why did he think it had to be me placing the stones? That comment about a blood connection? Martha hesitated. Dad believed Jeremy had formed a specific bond with you through your blood oath. That your blood was what activated the stones Jeremy used. Frank recalled the small pocketknife Jeremy had produced that night, how they'd both winced as they dragged the blade across their palms. "Blood to find you," Jeremy had whispered as they pressed their bleeding hands together. "Blood to bring you home." "This is insane," Frank muttered, but without conviction. The weight of evidence, the journal, the historical patterns, the impossibly recovered stone, was becoming difficult to dismiss. "Maybe," Martha conceded, "but what if it's not? What if there really is something underneath Millwater? Something that takes people every few decades? Something that's trying to come through more often now?" Frank had no answer. Outside, the afternoon light was fading, the sky darkening with both approaching night and another incoming storm. The wind had picked up, moaning around the eaves of the house like a living thing in pain. "We should finish before dark," Martha said. "Dad's notes say the water rises at night." They returned to the basement, Frank carrying the 13 stones they'd selected. 12 that their father had collected, plus Jeremy's chipped one. Martha brought candles, salt, and their father's journal. The basement felt different now, colder, damper. Frank could hear water trickling somewhere. A steady plink-plink that seemed to come from the deepest pit, the one with the tunnel at the bottom. "The primary circle goes here," Martha said, referring to the journal as she marked a spot in the center of the basement. "Dad already prepared most of the space. We just need to place the stones and complete the final marking." Frank knelt at the edge of the marked circle, laying out the stones as Martha directed. 12 in an outer ring, evenly spaced. The 13th, Jeremy's, would go in the center, but only after the rest of the ritual was complete. As they worked, Frank became aware of the water sounds growing louder. The trickling had become a steady flow, and when he glanced toward the pit, he saw that water was indeed rising from the tunnel below, pooling at the bottom. "Martha," he said quietly, nodding toward the pit. She followed his gaze, her face paling. "We need to hurry." They worked faster, Martha reading instructions from the journal, while Frank drew the remaining symbols on the basement floor using a mixture of salt, ash, and his own blood. Just a few drops, pressed from a small cut on his fingertip. The symbols were unlike anything he'd seen before. Not quite letters, not quite pictographs, but somehow meaningful in a way that resonated deep in his subconscious. The water continued to rise, now filling the pit and beginning to seep into the adjacent trenches. The sound it made was wrong. Not the gentle lapping of normal water, but a thick, viscous noise, like a mouth working around something too large to swallow. "Almost done," Martha said, her voice tight with urgency. "Just need to light the candles and place the center stone." Frank positioned the 13 candles at specific points around and within the circle, lighting each one. The flames burned unnaturally straight, despite the increasingly noticeable movement of air in the basement. Not a draft, but a pulsing, as if the space itself were breathing. "Now the final stone," Martha instructed. "It has to be you, Frank. And you need to." She hesitated, reading from the journal. "You need to call to him, to Jeremy. Invite him to help seal the passage." Frank balked. "Call to him? Like a seance?" "Not a seance." Martha shook her head. "More like opening a channel. Dad believed Jeremy is trapped at the threshold, neither here nor below. That he's been trying to warn us, to help us close what he accidentally opened." Frank held Jeremy's stone in his palm, feeling its unnatural warmth pulsing like a heartbeat. The water continued to rise from the pit, now filling most of the trenches. It moved with purpose, seeming to reach toward the circle they'd created. "What do I say?" Frank asked, his throat dry. "Whatever feels right." Dad said the words matter less than the intent. Frank knelt at the edge of the circle, Jeremy's stone clutched in his fist. The candle flames danced as the basement air grew heavier, charged with something that made the hair on Frank's arms stand on end. "Jeremy," he began, feeling foolish but pushing through. "If you're here, if you can hear me, we're trying to close the door. The one you opened. The one that took you." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the candles flickered simultaneously, their flames stretching toward the center of the circle, as if drawn by an invisible force. "We made a promise," Frank continued, his voice stronger now. "I promised I'd come for you if you got lost. I promised I'd help you close the door if they tried to come through." He opened his hand, revealing the stone. "I have your key, Jeremy. Show me how to use it." The temperature in the basement plummeted. Frank could see his breath clouding in front of him. The water in the trenches stopped its advance, becoming utterly still, its surface like black glass. "Frank," Martha whispered, her wide eyes fixed on a point behind him. "Look." He turned slowly. At the edge of the basement, where the shadows were deepest, stood a figure. It was Jeremy, unmistakably Jeremy, but wrong in subtle, horrifying ways. His skin was pale to the point of translucence, the blue veins beneath clearly visible. His eyes were too large, too dark. His proportions were slightly elongated, as if he'd been stretched. But the smile was Jeremy's. The same crooked grin that had always meant adventure, usually of the forbidden kind. "You came back," the thing that looked like Jeremy said, its voice bubbling as if spoken through water. "I knew you would." Frank couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Martha made a small, strangled sound beside him. "Jeremy?" Frank managed finally. "Is it really you?" The figure tilted its head at an impossible angle. "Parts of me. Enough to remember." It glided closer, not walking, but moving as if suspended in invisible water. "Enough to help. We're trying to close the passage," Frank said, holding up the stone. "Your stone. Dad thought it was the key." Jeremy's form flickered like a bad transmission. "Not the key. The lock." He pointed toward the center of the circle. It goes there, but it needs to be sealed. With blood. Frank hesitated. My blood. Our blood. The oath. It's how I found my way back to the threshold. Jeremy's expression darkened. But hurry. They know what you're doing. They're coming. As if on cue, the water in the trenches began to move again. Not flowing but undulating, like something large was moving beneath its surface. Place the stone, Martha urged, her voice shaking. Complete the circle. Frank leaned forward, extending his hand over the center of the circle. The moment his arm crossed the boundary of salt and symbols, an electric shock ran through him. Not painful, but intensely unpleasant, like plunging into water too cold for human tolerance. Now, Jeremy said, suddenly beside him, moving with that unnatural, floating grace. Cut your palm, like before. Let the blood touch the stone as you place it. Frank pulled out his pocket knife, the same one he'd carried since adolescence, a habit he'd never examined too closely. With a grimace, he drew the blade across his palm, watching as blood welled up in a bright red line. Hurry, Jeremy urged, his form becoming less distinct, more fluid. They're almost here. Frank closed his bloody hand around the stone, then placed it in the center of the circle. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The candle flames shot upward, forming a brief wall of fire around the circle. The symbols on the floor and walls began to glow with a sickly blue-green light. The water in the trenches reacted violently, churning and frothing as if boiling. From the pit came a sound. A scream, but not human, more like the shriek of metal tearing, amplified to an impossible volume. Cover your ears, Jeremy shouted, his voice barely audible over the din. Frank and Martha clapped their hands over their ears, but the sound penetrated anyway, vibrating in their skulls, making their teeth ache. The basement walls shook, dirt and concrete dust raining down from above. Then suddenly silence, absolute and complete. The candles still burned, their flames now normal. The water in the trenches had receded, leaving only muddy depressions. The stone at the center of the circle had changed, no longer smooth and gray, but rough and black as if charred. Jeremy's form stood at the edge of the circle, more transparent now, fading like a photograph left in the sun. Is it done? Frank asked, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. Is it closed? Jeremy's smile was sad. For now, the door is locked, but not destroyed. It will weaken again eventually. How long? Martha asked. Jeremy seemed to consider this, his form growing fainter by the second. Longer than before. Many decades, maybe. Time moves differently below. Frank felt a desperate need to keep Jeremy there, to get answers to the questions that had haunted him for 30 years. What is down there, Jeremy? What took you? Jeremy's form flickered, becoming briefly more solid. His expression was difficult to read. Part fear, part wonder, part something else entirely. The hollow places, he said. Older than anything. First. Dark. Beautiful in a terrible way. He looked directly at Frank, and for a moment, he was fully the Jeremy that Frank remembered. The curious boy with mischievous eyes and boundless imagination. They're not evil, exactly. Just hungry. They want to come back up. To reclaim what was once theirs. And you? Frank asked, voice breaking. Are you alive down there? Jeremy's laugh was like water dripping in a cave. Not alive like you. Not dead like you understand it. Just existing, learning, swimming in the deep. His form began to dissolve, becoming mist-like. You kept your promise, Frankie. You helped me close the door. Will we see you again? Martha asked, tears streaming down her face. Jeremy was barely visible now, just a suggestion of shape in the basement's shadows. When the water rises, when the thin places grow thinner, listen for me in your dreams. And then he was gone. Frank and Martha stood in silence for a long time, staring at the place where their childhood friend had been. The basement felt empty now, ordinary, just a concrete space with strange markings and a history they could never share. What do we do now? Martha finally asked. Frank looked at the stone circle. At the basement their father had torn apart in his desperate attempt to save the town that had labeled him a madman. We fill in the holes, he said. We clean up the symbols. We bury Dad. He looked at his sister. And then we decide whether to stay or go. Martha's eyebrows rose. Stay? You'd consider staying in Millwater? Frank thought about it. For 30 years, he'd run from this place, from the memory of what had happened at the lake. He'd built a life designed to keep him distanced from anything resembling the supernatural event that had shaped his childhood. But now, having faced it, having seen Jeremy again, someone needs to watch for the signs, he said quietly. Someone needs to remember what's down there, what we did here tonight. We could take turns, Martha suggested. I could stay for a few years, then you. We wouldn't both need to be here all the time. Frank nodded, relief washing over him. That could work. They began cleaning up, removing the candles, sweeping the salt patterns away. The stone at the center of the circle, Jeremy's stone, they left untouched. It seemed important somehow, an anchor point for the barrier they'd helped create. As they worked, Frank found himself thinking about the cycles Harold had documented. 30 years between incidents, weakening barriers, a hunger from below that never truly went away, just retreated temporarily. And Jeremy, not gone but transformed, existing in some state between life and death in the hollow places beneath Millwater. Frank knew he'd dream about him now. Not nightmares as he had for decades, but something more complex. Messages, perhaps. Warnings about the water rising. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the night clear and star-filled. Frank stepped onto the porch, breathing in the clean air, letting it wash away the basement's lingering smell. In the distance, he could see the faint silvery gleam of Lake Millwater catching the moonlight. Calm now, still, but not empty. Never empty. Every town has its secrets. In Millwater, they run deep, flowing through underground streams, collecting in dark pools, whispering beneath the foundations of houses built on land that was never meant to be settled. Frank Hadley stays for 6 months after his father's funeral. He helps Martha clean out the old house, repair the basement floor, and catalog Harold's research. They establish a system. Martha will live in the house for 5 years, then Frank will take over. They'll watch for signs. They'll listen for whispers. They'll check the lake regularly for perfectly round stones washing up on shore. On his last night before returning to Boston, Frank walks alone to Lake Millwater. The water is calm, reflecting the full moon like a perfect mirror. He stands at the shore, at the exact spot where Jeremy was taken 30 years ago. I kept my promise, he says to the still water. The rest is up to you. There's no response. No ghostly apparition. No bubbling voice from the depths. Just the gentle lap of water against the shore and the distant call of a night bird. But as Frank turns to leave, he notices something on the rocks near his feet. A small, perfectly round stone, wet as if just washed up by the lake. When he picks it up, it's warm to the touch, pulsing gently like a tiny heart. He places it in his pocket next to the other one, a matching set, one dark, one light. Keys or locks, depending on how they're used. Markers of the thin places. Frank walks back toward town, feeling the weight of the stones in his pocket. The water behind him remains still, but beneath its surface, something shifts. Something vast and patient that has existed in the hollow places since before humans walked the earth. Something that can wait another 30 years. Something that remembers the taste of Jeremy Wilcox and dreams of the world above. And in the deep below, Jeremy swims through lightless waters, neither fully human nor fully other, watching the barrier Frank and Martha created, keeping his own promise to guard the door from both sides. He knows it's not forever. Nothing is forever in the deep below. But for now, it's enough. The end. Beneath the aspen grove. 1. Henry Caldwell pulled his weathered pickup to the side of the road, the tires crunching on the gravel shoulder as the engine sputtered to silence. He sat for a moment, staring through the dusty windshield at the small handmade sign that read, Welcome T.O. Millfield, where neighbors are family. The paint was chipping, and one corner of the sign hung loose, swaying slightly in the late September breeze. Family. The word brought a bitter taste to Henry's mouth. He reached for the manila envelope on the passenger seat, its edges worn from the countless times he'd opened and closed it over the past week. Inside was the deed to his late brother's house, along with the lawyer's letter explaining that Jack had left everything to him. Jack Caldwell, dead at 53. Aggressive cancer, they said. From diagnosis to death in 6 months. 6 months during which Jack hadn't bothered to call his only brother. Stubborn asshole to the end, Henry muttered, slipping the envelope into his jacket pocket. They hadn't spoken in nearly 20 years, not since their mother's funeral, when a lifetime of resentments had erupted into a fistfight in the church parking lot. The memory still stung. Jack's accusations, the blame, the things they'd both said that couldn't be unsaid. Henry drove slowly through downtown Millfield, population 842 according to the faded sign. Not much had changed in 2 decades. The same brick storefronts lined Main Street, though more than half of them appeared vacant now. The hardware store was still there, and Doreen's diner with its neon coffee cup flickering in the window. A few locals glanced at his truck as he passed, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Small towns had long memories. Following the directions he'd scribbled down, Henry turned onto Sycamore Lane and then again onto a narrow, unpaved road that led toward the outskirts of town. Trees crowded in on both sides, their branches forming a canopy overhead that filtered the afternoon sunlight into dancing patterns on his windshield. And then he saw it, Jack's house. No, his house now. It sat alone at the end of the road, a 2-story Victorian with peeling blue paint and a sagging porch. Behind it stretched a dense wall of aspen trees, their white trunks stark against the darker forest beyond. A breeze rustled through the golden leaves, creating a whispering sound that somehow made the hair on Henry's arms stand up. He parked in the overgrown driveway and shut off the engine. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the cooling tick of the engine and that persistent whispering from the aspen grove. Henry grabbed his duffel bag from the back seat and approached the house, each step feeling heavier than the last. The key slid into the lock with surprising ease. The door opened with a long, plaintive creak. "Home sweet home," Henry said to no one. The air inside was stale and carried an unpleasant medicinal smell, evidence of Jack's final months. Henry stood in the entryway, taking in the dusty furniture, the faded wallpaper, the framed photographs he couldn't bring himself to look at closely. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, as if the house itself had been slowly dying alongside its owner. He dropped his bag on the floor and walked through to the kitchen. Dirty dishes filled the sink, and prescription bottles lined the counter, their labels bearing Jack's name and warnings in bold red letters. Henry opened the refrigerator and immediately recoiled at the smell of spoiled food. "Jesus, Jack," he muttered, slamming it shut. In the living room, papers were scattered across a desk in the corner. Medical bills, insurance forms, and what looked like pages torn from a journal. Henry picked up one of the loose pages, Jack's familiar handwriting sprawling across it. "They're getting closer. I can hear them at night now, moving beneath the aspen grove. Nobody believes me. Doc Sanders says it's the medication, says my mind is playing tricks. But I know what I hear. I know what I've seen. They're waiting for something." Henry frowned, setting the page down. The cancer must have spread to Jack's brain toward the end. He looked around the room, noticing for the first time the way all the curtains were drawn tight, how extra locks had been installed on every window. A soft noise from upstairs made him freeze. It sounded like a footstep or something being dragged across the floor. Henry held his breath, listening. The house settled back into silence. "Just an old house making old house noises," he said aloud, but his voice sounded unconvincing even to his own ears. He climbed the stairs slowly, wincing at each creak underfoot. The upper hallway was dark, lined with 4 closed doors. He tried the first one, a bathroom small and outdated with rust stains in the tub. The second door revealed a spare bedroom, the mattress bare and dust covers draped over the furniture. At the third door, Henry paused. This had been Jack's room when they were kids, before their parents had died and before everything between them had soured. He turned the knob and pushed the door open. The smell hit him first, antiseptic and something darker underneath like decay. A hospital bed dominated the center of the room, the sheets still rumpled as if Jack had just gotten up. Medical equipment surrounded it, an oxygen tank, and four-stand, a bedside commode. A small table nearby held more prescription bottles, a water glass with a film on its surface, and a leather-bound journal. Henry approached the bed slowly, half expecting to find his brother still lying there, withered and accusing. Instead, he found only a depression in the mattress where a body had lain for months. He picked up the journal from the bedside table, flipping it open to a random page. October 3rd. The whispers are louder tonight. They know my name now. They're calling to me from beneath the trees. I told Sarah when she brought my dinner, but she just gave me that pitying look, patted my hand like I'm a child. Maybe I am losing my mind. But if I am, why do the aspens lean toward the house at night? Why do their shadows move against the moon? Henry closed the journal, a chill running through him despite the stuffiness of the room. Jack had always had an overactive imagination, even as a kid. The cancer, the medications, they must have amplified that tendency, turned it toxic. He moved to the window and pulled back the heavy curtain. From this vantage point, he could see the entire aspen grove spreading out behind the house, a sea of golden leaves shimmering in the late afternoon light. Beautiful, but somehow unsettling in their uniformity. Henry knew enough about trees to understand that aspens weren't individual trees at all, but a single organism connected by their root system. One vast, ancient thing pretending to be many. As he watched, the wind picked up, sending a wave through the leaves that almost looked deliberate, like a signal passing from one end of the grove to the other. For just a moment, he could have sworn he heard his name whispered among the rustling. Henry let the curtain fall back into place. He was tired from the long drive, that was all. And being in Jack's house, surrounded by the evidence of his brother's final, lonely days, it was getting to him. He would sell the place, of course. Clear it out, fix what needed fixing, put it on the market. 2 weeks, 3 at most, and he'd be done with Millfield for good. Done with Jack's ghost and all their unfinished business. The final door in the hallway was closed, a padlock securing it from the outside. Henry frowned, rattling the lock. What had Jack been trying to keep out or in? He made a mental note to look for the key. As he turned away, the setting sun broke through a gap in the curtains, casting long shadows across the hallway floor. For an instant, one shadow seemed to move independently of the others, stretching toward him like a grasping hand. Henry blinked and it was gone. Just his imagination. Just the weight of old memories and older regrets. Outside, the aspens continued their whispering as darkness began to fall. 2. Henry woke with a start, his heart pounding against his ribs. The living room was dark around him, the only light coming from the TV screen where the Netflix "Are you still watching?" prompt glowed accusingly. He must have fallen asleep on the couch. His phone told him it was 2:17 a.m. What had woken him? He sat perfectly still, listening. The house creaked and settled, but underneath that familiar sound was something else. A faint scratching, like fingernails dragging slowly across wood. It seemed to be coming from the walls. "Mice," Henry muttered. "Great." He switched on the lamp beside the couch, casting the room in a warm yellow glow that somehow made the shadows in the corners seem deeper. The scratching stopped immediately. Henry rubbed his eyes, grimacing at the sour taste in his mouth. He'd found a bottle of Jack Daniels in a kitchen cabinet and had drunk more than he'd intended, trying to dull the strange, oppressive feeling the house gave him. Now his head throbbed, and his thoughts felt sluggish. Rising stiffly from the couch, he made his way to the kitchen for a glass of water. He'd managed to clean out the refrigerator earlier, gagging at the science experiments that had once been food. Now it hummed quietly in the darkness, the only appliance he'd bothered to turn on. As he filled a glass at the sink, Henry glanced out the window above it. The backyard was bathed in moonlight, the aspen grove a wall of silver-white trunks and rustling leaves at its edge. Something moved among the trees, a flash of paleness that might have been an animal, or a face. Henry tensed, straining his eyes to see better through the dirty glass. Nothing moved now, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him from the darkness between the trees. The scratching sound came again, louder this time, from somewhere in the ceiling above him. Definitely not mice. The sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Pause. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Hello, Henry called, feeling foolish even as he said it. Is someone there? The only answer was the continued scratching, now moving across the ceiling toward the hallway. Setting down his water glass, Henry grabbed a heavy flashlight from a drawer and followed the sound, his pulse quickening with each step. The scratching led him to the staircase, then stopped. Henry stood at the bottom of the stairs, flashlight gripped tightly in his hand, listening to the silence. Just as he was about to turn away, convinced he'd imagined it all, a new sound reached him. A soft thump from the second floor, followed by the creak of floorboards as if someone were walking slowly down the hallway. This is private property, Henry called, trying to sound authoritative despite the tremor in his voice. I'm armed. He wasn't, but whoever was up there didn't need to know that. No response came. Only another creak, this one from the direction of the padlocked door. Henry's rational mind told him to call the police, to wait outside for them to arrive and check the house. Instead, he found himself climbing the stairs, each step requiring a deliberate effort as if some part of him were fighting against the ascent. The second-floor hallway was even darker than before, the moonlight barely penetrating through the heavy curtains. Henry swept his flashlight beam from one end to the other, revealing nothing but dust motes floating in the air. He moved cautiously toward the padlocked door, listening intently. Was that breathing on the other side, or just the wind finding its way through some crack in the old house? Jack! The name escaped his lips before he could stop it. Henry shook his head at his own foolishness. His brother was dead, cremated, his ashes scattered in the lake where they'd fished as boys. There was no one in the house but him, yet the feeling of being watched persisted, growing stronger with each passing moment. The air felt thick, almost difficult to breathe, and carried a strange earthy smell, like freshly turned soil and decomposing leaves. The padlock on the door gleamed dully in the flashlight beam. Henry touched it, surprised to find it warm to the touch, as if someone had been holding it. "What were you hiding, Jack?" he whispered. As if in answer, a violent scratching erupted from behind the door, so sudden and fierce that Henry stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. It sounded like an animal trapped and desperate to escape. Heart hammering, Henry retreated down the hallway and practically ran down the stairs. In the living room, he snatched up his phone and dialed 911 with shaking fingers. 911, what's your emergency? A woman's voice, calm and professional. I need the police, Henry said, trying to keep his voice steady. I think there's someone in my house. Or something. At 47 Sycamore Lane. Something, sir? He could hear keyboard clicks as she entered the information. An animal, maybe. I don't know. There's a locked room upstairs, and something's in there, scratching to get out. Pause. 47 Sycamore? That's the old Caldwell place. Yes.
I'm Henry Caldwell.
My brother Jack died recently, and I inherited the house. Another pause, longer this time. When the dispatcher spoke again, her voice had changed subtly. I'm sending an officer to your location, Mr. Caldwell. Please wait outside until they arrive. Thank you, Henry said, but she had already hung up. He stood in the middle of the living room, torn between following her advice and his own curiosity about what was behind that door. The scratching had stopped, but now he could hear that whispering sound again, like the rustling of the aspen leaves, but somehow inside the house. Telling himself he was just going to peek out the back window before heading outside to wait for the police, Henry moved toward the kitchen. The whispering grew louder with each step, forming patterns that almost sounded like words. At the window, he pressed his face close to the glass, trying to see into the darkness. The aspens swayed in a wind he couldn't feel inside the house, their white trunks gleaming in the moonlight. Was it his imagination, or were they closer to the house than they had been earlier? A sudden movement caught his eye, a figure standing at the edge of the grove. Henry's breath caught in his throat. The figure was tall and unnaturally thin, its body seemingly composed of the same white bark as the aspen trunks. Its face, if it could be called that, was a hollow depression with two darker spots where eyes should be. As Henry watched, frozen in horror, the figure took a jerky step forward, then another, moving with a stilted gait like a marionette. Behind it, more figures emerged from among the trees, each with the same bark-like skin and empty face. They were coming toward the house. Henry stumbled backward, knocking over a chair in his haste. This wasn't real. Couldn't be real. He was dreaming, or the whiskey had been bad, or... A heavy knock at the front door made him yelp in surprise. For a moment, he thought the bark creatures had reached the house already. But then a human voice called out, "Police! Mr. Caldwell, are you in there?" Relief flooded through him. Henry rushed to the front door and threw it open to find a middle-aged officer standing on the porch, hand resting casually on his holstered weapon. "Officer," Henry gasped. "Thank God, there's something out there in the trees. Some kind of..." "Slow down, sir," the officer interrupted, his expression a mixture of wariness and something like pity. "I'm Deputy Collins. Why don't you tell me what's going on?" Henry took a deep breath, suddenly aware of how he must look, wild-eyed, disheveled, reeking of whiskey. "I heard scratching in the walls, and then upstairs behind a locked door, and now there are things coming out of the aspen grove. You need to see." Deputy Collins glanced past Henry into the house, then back at his face. "Mind if I come in and take a look around? Please." Henry stepped aside, relief making his knees weak. The deputy entered, removing his hat and looking around with the casual assessment of someone who'd been in the house before. "You just got into town, right? For Jack's place?" "Yesterday," Henry confirmed, closing the door behind them. "Did you know my brother?" "Everyone knows everyone in Millfield," Collins said, which wasn't really an answer. Jack kept to himself these last few months. Illness hit him hard. "He didn't tell me he was sick," Henry said, the old bitterness creeping into his voice. "I had to hear it from his lawyer after he was already gone." Collins nodded, as if this confirmed something he already knew. "You two weren't close then?"
No.
"Not for a long time." Henry shook his head, impatient. "Look, that's not important right now. There's something locked in the upstairs room, and there are things outside. Why don't we check upstairs first?" Collins suggested, his tone that of an adult humoring a frightened child. Henry led the way up the stairs, aware of the deputy's scrutinizing gaze on his back. In the hallway, he pointed to the padlocked door. That's where the scratching was coming from. It sounded like an animal trying to get out. Collins approached the door, examining the padlock. "You haven't found the key?"
No.
"It wasn't with the house keys the lawyer gave me." The deputy nodded thoughtfully. Jack was pretty paranoid toward the end. Cancer had spread to his brain, according to Doc Sanders. Made him see and hear things that weren't there. Henry frowned. "What kinds of things?" "Oh, all sorts. Thought the trees were moving at night. Thought something was trying to get into the house." Collins tapped the padlock with his finger. "Maybe that's why he locked this room up tight, to keep the imaginary monsters out." "Or in," Henry muttered. Collins gave him a sharp look. "What was that?" "Nothing. Can we open it? I want to know what's in there." "I can get a bolt cutter from my car," Collins offered. "But are you sure you want to? Sometimes it's better to let sleeping dogs lie, especially when it comes to family secrets." Something in the deputy's tone made Henry uneasy, but he nodded firmly. "I need to know." Collins shrugged. "Your house, your call. Wait here." As the deputy's footsteps receded down the stairs, Henry pressed his ear against the padlocked door, listening. No scratching now, but was that breathing he heard? Slow and labored, like someone or something sleeping fitfully? A noise from outside drew his attention to the window at the end of the hallway. Pulling back the curtain, Henry looked out at the backyard and the aspen grove beyond. The moon had gone behind a cloud, casting everything in deep shadow. He couldn't see the bark creatures anymore, But the trees themselves seemed closer somehow, the front line of white trunks now just yards from the back of the house. That's impossible, he told himself. Trees don't move. But even as the thought formed, he remembered what he knew about aspens, how they were all connected underground, how a single grove could be thousands of years old, spreading slowly but inexorably across the landscape. The sound of heavy boots on the stairs announced the deputy's return. Collins held up a pair of bolt cutters, their jaws gleaming in the dim light. "Last chance to change your mind," he said. Henry stepped aside, gesturing for the deputy to proceed. "Cut it." With a grunt of effort, Collins severed the padlock's shackle. It fell to the floor with a heavy clunk that seemed to echo through the entire house. For a moment, both men stood still, as if waiting for something to happen. "Well," Collins said finally, "shall we?" Henry reached for the doorknob, then hesitated. What if Jack really had been hiding something? What if the things he'd written about in his journal weren't delusions but warnings? Too late for second thoughts. He turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room beyond was pitch black. Henry fumbled for a light switch on the wall, finding it and flipping it up. A single bare bulb in the ceiling flickered to life, revealing a small, empty room. No furniture, no windows, just bare wooden floorboards and plain white walls. No, not entirely empty. In the center of the floor was a large circle drawn in what looked like black paint. Strange symbols marked its circumference, and in the center lay a small object that Henry couldn't immediately identify. "What the hell?" he murmured, stepping cautiously into the room. Deputy Collins remained in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Your brother got into some strange stuff near the end." Henry approached the circle slowly. Now he could see that the object in its center was a small carving made of what appeared to be bone. A crude human figure with exaggerated limbs and a featureless face. Around it were scattered dried leaves and twigs, and what looked disturbingly like clumps of human hair. "Is that?" Henry started to ask, but was interrupted by a sudden gust of wind that swept through the room, making the bare bulb swing wildly overhead. With it came that whispering sound again, louder now, almost articulate. "Henry, Henry, we've waited so long." The floorboards beneath the circle began to tremble, then crack. Dirt seeped up through the widening fissures, bringing with it a smell of rot and decay that made Henry gag. "We need to go," Collins said sharply from the doorway. "Now!" But Henry found himself unable to move, transfixed by the sight of pale, root-like tendrils pushing up through the broken floor. They writhed in the air for a moment before curling around the bone carving, caressing it almost lovingly. Jack promised a replacement. Brother for brother. The whispering was inside Henry's head now, drowning out everything else. He was vaguely aware of Collins grabbing his arm, trying to pull him away, but it felt distant and unimportant compared to the voices calling to him from below. "What did Jack promise you?" Henry heard himself asking, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. "Life for life. He was dying anyway, but you're strong. You'll feed us for years." More roots burst through the floor, thick as a man's wrist now, reaching for Henry with unmistakable purpose. He tried to back away, but his legs wouldn't obey him. Instead, he took a step forward, then another, approaching the widening hole in the floor. "Caldwell, snap out of it." Collins's voice seemed to come from miles away. The deputy's grip on his arm tightened painfully, finally breaking through the trance. Henry blinked, suddenly aware of the danger. He tried to turn, to flee, but the roots moved with terrifying speed, wrapping around his ankles. "Help me!" he cried as he lost his balance, falling hard onto the wooden floor. Collins grabbed both his arms, bracing his feet against the doorframe as he fought to hold Henry in place. The roots pulled in the opposite direction, drawing Henry inexorably toward the hole inch by inch. "The carving!" Collins shouted. "Destroy the carving!" Henry twisted, reaching desperately toward the bone figure that still lay within the circle. His fingers brushed against it, then closed around it. The moment he touched it, an electric shock of revulsion passed through him. The bone was warm, pulsing like a living heart. The roots tightened their grip, one wrapping around his wrist, trying to make him release the carving. Pain shot up Henry's arm as the root surface revealed itself to be covered in tiny, thorn-like protrusions that dug into his flesh. With a cry of pain and determination, Henry smashed the carving against the floor. It didn't break. He tried again, harder, and felt a small crack form in the bone. The whispering turned to howling, furious, hungry screams that filled the room and made both men wince in pain. The roots convulsed, their grip momentarily loosening. Collins used the opportunity to haul Henry backwards several feet. Break it completely. Henry raised the carving high and brought it down with all his strength against the edge of a broken floorboard. This time it shattered, fragments of bone scattering across the floor. An unearthly wail rose from the hole, accompanied by a violent tremor that shook the entire house. The roots writhed as if in agony, then began to retreat, sliding back into the earth from which they'd emerged. Collins dragged Henry the rest of the way out of the room and slammed the door shut. Both men leaned against the wall in the hallway, gasping for breath. What the fuck was that? Henry managed between ragged breaths. Collins wiped sweat from his brow with a shaking hand. Something old. Something that's been in these woods a lot longer than Millfield has existed. He glanced at Henry with a mix of pity and accusation. Something your brother made a deal with. A deal? Jack would never. He was dying, Collins interrupted. People do desperate things when they're facing the end, especially people who are alone. The implication hung in the air between them. If Henry hadn't abandoned his brother, if they hadn't wasted 20 years on a pointless feud, maybe Jack wouldn't have turned to whatever dwelled beneath the aspen grove. But what did he? A tremendous crack from outside cut off Henry's question. Both men rushed to the window in time to see the aspen trees nearest the house toppling, their roots tearing free of the earth as they fell. A chain reaction spread through the grove, tree after tree collapsing like dominoes, revealing the extensive root network that had connected them all. It's dying, Collins said quietly. Whatever it was, breaking that carving must have severed its connection to our world. Henry wasn't so sure. As he watched the destruction of the grove, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't an ending but a transformation, that whatever had been contained and rooted in place was now free to move beyond its boundaries. We should get out of here, he said urgently. It isn't safe. Collins nodded, and the two men hurried downstairs and out to the front porch. In the distance, lights were coming on in neighboring houses, people woken by the commotion. What do we tell them? Henry asked, gesturing toward the approaching figures of concerned neighbors. The deputy straightened his uniform, composing himself. A sinkhole, old mining tunnels under the grove finally collapsed. Nothing more. They won't believe that. You'd be surprised what people will believe when the alternative is too terrible to contemplate. Collins gave him a meaningful look. The question is, what are you going to do now? Henry gazed back at the house, at the second-floor window where the padlocked room lurked. Whatever Jack had invited in might be weakened, but he doubted it was gone completely, and he couldn't shake the whispered words from his mind. Jack promised us a replacement. I'm not running away, he said finally. This was Jack's problem, and now it's mine. I'm going to find out exactly what he did, what he unleashed, and then I'm going to finish what we started tonight. Collins studied him for a long moment, then nodded. You're more like your brother than you know. He reached into his pocket and handed Henry a business card. When you're ready to talk more, call me. But be careful what you go digging for, Mr. Caldwell. Some things are better left buried. As the deputy walked away to deal with the gathering crowd, Henry turned to face the house once more. In a second-floor window, not the padlocked room, but Jack's bedroom, a shadow moved against the glass. For just an instant, he thought he saw a face looking back at him. A familiar face, gaunt with illness but unmistakable. Jack. Henry blinked, and the apparition was gone. But the whisper remained, carried on the night breeze that stirred the fallen leaves at his feet. Brother for brother, life for life. Behind the house, the last of the aspen trees toppled with a tremendous crash, and darkness fell over Millfield once more. 3 days later, Henry sat at Jack's desk, surrounded by stacks of papers and old leather-bound books. After the night of the sinkhole, as the town was now calling it, he'd thrown himself into research, trying to understand what his brother had been involved in. Jack's journals provided disturbing glimpses, descriptions of an entity he'd discovered living beneath the aspen grove, a being he claimed had been worshipped by the original settlers of the area in exchange for bountiful harvests and protection from disease. According to Jack's increasingly paranoid entries, he'd made contact with the entity during the early stages of his illness, offering it regular blood sacrifices, his own, drawn during chemotherapy sessions, in exchange for more time. But as his condition worsened, the entity had demanded more. "It wants a replacement," Jack had written in a shaky hand dated just 2 weeks before his death. "Not just blood anymore. A life for a life. It knows about Henry, says we share the same essence. Brothers. Can use him instead." The words made Henry's skin crawl every time he read them. His own brother had considered sacrificing him to whatever hungry thing lived beneath the aspen grove. Yet he couldn't bring himself to hate Jack for it. The later journal entries showed a man tortured by the choice, veering between desperate self-preservation and guilt-ridden resistance. In the final entry, dated 3 days before his death, Jack had written, "I've locked it away as best I can. The binding circle should hold it, keep it from reaching beyond the grove. I won't give it Henry. Some lines shouldn't be crossed, even in the face of death. But it's patient. It will wait for him to come. And he will come. I've made sure of that." Henry rubbed his tired eyes. Jack had known that leaving him the house would bring him to Millfield. Had he wanted Henry to destroy the entity, or had he simply lacked the strength to resist its demands in the end? A knock at the front door interrupted his thoughts. Rising stiffly from the desk, Henry went to answer it, half expecting to find Deputy Collins checking up on him again. Instead, he found a young woman with auburn hair and weary eyes, a medical bag clutched in one hand. "You must be Henry," she said, offering her free hand.
I'm Sarah Winters.
"I was your brother's hospice nurse." Henry shook her hand, the name clicking into place. "Jack mentioned you in his journals. You were with him at the end." Sarah nodded, her expression somber. "I was. May I come in? There are some things I think you should know." Henry stepped aside, letting her enter. They settled in the living room, where he'd made some effort to clean up the clutter of Jack's final months. "You've been going through his papers," Sarah observed, nodding toward the stacks of journals and books visible through the study door, trying to make sense of what happened to him, what he became involved with. Sarah's gaze was steady, assessing. "And what have you found?" Henry hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. How much would she believe? Jack wrote about something living under the aspen grove, an entity of some kind. He thought it could extend his life if he made sacrifices to it. To his surprise, Sarah didn't look shocked or skeptical. Instead, she set her medical bag on the coffee table and opened it, removing a small voice recorder. "Jack asked me to give you this if you ever came back to Millfield. I'm not supposed to do this. Hospice records are confidential." But he was persuasive. She placed the recorder on the table between them. "It's his final confession, made the day before he died." Henry stared at the small device as if it might bite him. "Why didn't you go to the police?" Sarah gave a bitter laugh. "And tell them what? That a dying man was rambling about ancient forces living under the trees? That he'd performed occult rituals to try to save himself? They'd have written it off as delirium from the pain medication." She shook her head. "Besides, by the time I understood how serious it was, Jack was already gone." "But you believe it," Henry said slowly. "You believe what he was saying was real." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her fingers absently tracing a scar on her wrist. A perfectly circular mark that Henry somehow knew had been made by a root-like tendril with thorn-covered skin. "I've lived in Millfield my whole life," she finally said. "The aspen grove has always been here, always been strange. As kids, we were told never to play there after dark. People who built too close to it reported nightmares, heard whispers. Animals wouldn't go near it. She met Henry's gaze directly. Jack wasn't the first person to make contact with whatever lives there. He was just the first in a long time to give it what it wanted. Henry leaned forward, pressing the play button on the recorder before he could lose his nerve. Jack's voice, thin and ravaged by illness but unmistakably his brother's, filled the room. Henry, if you're listening to this, then I'm gone and you've come to Millfield, just like it said you would. I should start by saying I'm sorry. Sorry for the 20 years of silence. Sorry for the things I said at Mom's funeral. And sorry for what I've unleashed. It started when I was diagnosed. Stage 4 already spread to the lymph nodes and liver. 6 months, they said. Maybe less. I couldn't accept that. Wouldn't. So I went looking for alternatives. There have always been stories about the Aspen Grove, local legends, old wives' tales. But buried in them was something real. The original settlers of Millfield weren't just farmers. They were occult worshippers of something they called the root. They believed it could heal sickness, bring prosperity, but only in exchange for sacrifice. I found their records in the Historical Society archives. Most people dismissed them as superstition, but I was desperate. I followed their rituals. I opened a doorway that should have stayed closed. At first, it seemed to work. The pain lessened. Scans showed the tumors shrinking, but it wanted more each time. Blood wasn't enough anymore. It wanted flesh. Then it wanted others. When it showed me what it really was, what it intended, I tried to break free. I locked it away as best I could, using the old binding rituals. But I know it's not enough. It's too strong now, Henry, and it wants you. You're wondering why I left you the house, knowing what was waiting here. The truth is I needed you to finish what I couldn't. The thing under the grove can't be allowed to escape into the world. It must be destroyed, and only a Caldwell can do it now. Blood calls to blood. There's a book in my desk drawer, wrapped in black cloth. It contains the ritual of unmaking. But be careful. Performing it will draw the entity's attention. It will fight back with everything it has. I wish we'd had more time, Henry. I wish I'd called you when I first got sick, before all this started. Maybe things would have been different. One last thing. Don't trust everyone in town. Some of them know. Some of them have been feeding it for years, long before I came along. Watch your back, brother. And if you can find it in your heart, forgive me. The recording ended with a click, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Henry sat motionless, absorbing his brother's confession. The depth of the horror Jack had unleashed finally becoming clear. He declined rapidly after making that recording, Sarah said quietly. Refused all medication at the end. Said he needed to feel the pain, that it was his penance. Do you know who else in town is involved? Henry asked. Sarah shook her head. Jack never told me names, but I've seen the signs. People who should have died from their illnesses suddenly recovering, followed by disappearances of strangers or drifters passing through. She hesitated. The grove has been here for generations. Its influence runs deep. Henry thought of Deputy Collins, his strange mixture of knowledge and wariness. Had he been warning Henry, or assessing a threat to whatever lurked beneath the trees? The entity is weakened now, he said. When the grove collapsed, something changed. I felt it. Don't fool yourself, Sarah warned. What you saw was just a manifestation, a physical anchor. The root itself lives deeper, older. The aspen trees were just fingers it extended into our world. She leaned forward intently. It's wounded, yes, but that makes it more dangerous, not less. It's hungry, and it still wants what Jack promised it. Henry rose and went to Jack's desk, opening the bottom drawer. Beneath a stack of medical bills, he found a package wrapped in black cloth, just as Jack had described. Unwrapping it revealed a small, ancient-looking book bound in cracked leather, its pages yellow with age. The ritual of unmaking, he murmured, turning it over in his hands. Sarah watched him with a mixture of fear and hope. Are you going to do it? Before Henry could answer, a low rumble shook the house, causing the lights to flicker. Outside, the sky had darkened prematurely, heavy clouds rolling in from the west. Storm's coming, Sarah observed, moving to the window. They're saying it might be the worst in decades. Henry joined her, looking out at the fallen aspen trees that still littered the property. In the 3 days since their collapse, the white bark had turned gray and begun to rot at an unnatural speed, filling the air with a sweetish, cloying smell. But now, as he watched, something moved among the fallen trunks, a subtle shifting, as if the roots were stirring beneath the soil. "It's not a storm," he said grimly. "It's waking up." Sarah's eyes widened as she followed his gaze. Where the roots of the aspens had been exposed, pale tendrils were slowly extending outward, seeking purchase in the dark earth. "How long do we have?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry opened the ancient book, scanning the faded text. "According to this, the ritual has to be performed at the heart of its domain, where it first entered our world." "The center of the grove," Sarah said, nodding. "There's a clearing there with a stone circle that predates the town. Local kids dare each other to spend the night there on Halloween." She shuddered. "None ever make it until dawn. It also requires items I don't have," Henry continued, reading further. "Specific herbs, a silver blade, something called water of vision." "I know someone who might help with that," Sarah said. "Eliza Garrett. People call her a witch, but she's really just an herbalist. Her family has been in Millfield as long as anyone can remember, and they've always kept watch, I guess you could say." Henry looked up from the book. "You seem to know a lot about all this." Sarah touched the circular scar on her wrist again. "When you've seen what I've seen, you start paying attention to the old stories." She met his gaze steadily. "I'll take you to Eliza, but first you need to be sure this is what you want to do. The ritual, it requires a sacrifice." "What kind of sacrifice?" "The book will tell you," she said, nodding toward the ancient tome. "But Jack wouldn't have asked this of you if there was any other way." Henry turned the page and found the answer, written in faded ink that seemed to crawl across the parchment. "To unmake what was made, a life freely given must balance the scales. Blood of the summoner's blood shall close the door forever." "Jack's blood," Henry said slowly. "But he's already dead." "Not Jack," Sarah corrected gently. "His bloodline. The book means you, Henry." The realization hit him like a physical blow. The ritual of unmaking would cost him his life. That's what Jack had been asking of him in his final message. Not just forgiveness, but the ultimate sacrifice. Before he could process this, another tremor shook the house, stronger this time. A crack appeared in the living room wall, spreading like a lightning bolt from floor to ceiling. And with it came the whispers, louder than before. "Henry, brother of our chosen, your time has come. We need to go," Sarah said urgently, grabbing her medical bag. "It's not safe here anymore." As if to emphasize her point, a section of the floor suddenly splintered, pale roots bursting through the wooden boards. They writhed in the air, reaching toward them with unmistakable purpose. Henry snatched up the book and followed Sarah to the front door, but it wouldn't open. The frame had warped, sealing it shut. Behind them, more roots erupted from the walls, the ceiling encroaching from all sides. "The back door!" Henry shouted, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her toward the kitchen. They ran, dodging the grasping tendrils that seemed to anticipate their movements. One caught Sarah's ankle, making her stumble. Henry turned back, seized a kitchen knife from the counter, and slashed at the root. It recoiled with a hissing sound, black ichor oozing from the cut. "It bleeds," he said, surprised. "Everything bleeds," Sarah replied grimly. "Even God's." They reached the back door just as the kitchen floor began to collapse, revealing a network of massive roots beneath the house's foundation. Sarah wrenched the door open, and they spilled out into the yard, gasping for breath. The sky above had turned an unnatural greenish-black, the air thick with the smell of decay. In the distance, car alarms were sounding, and people were emerging from their homes, looking up at the darkening sky in confusion and fear. "We need to get to Eliza's," Sarah said, pulling Henry toward her car parked at the curb. "She'll know what to do." As they drove through town, Henry saw that the disturbance wasn't isolated to Jack's property. Cracks had appeared in the streets, and in several places roots similar to those in the house had broken through the asphalt. People were shouting, pointing, some already throwing belongings into their cars in a panic. "It's spreading," Henry said, watching a massive root break through the window of the hardware store. "How is this possible?" "The aspen grove was just the visible part," Sarah explained, swerving to avoid a fissure opening in the road ahead. "Its root system extends under the entire town. Has for centuries." She glanced at him, her expression grim. "When you destroyed Jack's binding circle, you weakened its prison, but you also made it angry. Now it's trying to take what it's owed by force." They drove to the outskirts of town, where the houses grew farther apart and the forest pressed close to the road. Sarah turned onto a narrow dirt track that wound through dense trees, finally stopping before a small cottage almost hidden by overgrown vegetation. An elderly woman stood in the doorway as if she'd been expecting them, tall and straight-backed despite her age, with steel-gray hair pulled into a severe bun and eyes that seemed to pierce right through Henry. "So," she said as they approached, "Jack Caldwell's brother has finally come to clean up the mess." "Eliza," Sarah greeted her, "we need your help." The old woman's gaze traveled from Sarah to Henry, lingering on the book clutched in his hands. "I see he found the Hawkins grimoire. Nasty bit of work, that. Come inside, both of you. It's not safe out here." The interior of the cottage was a single room, crowded with dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, shelves lined with jars of unidentifiable substances, and books, hundreds of them, stacked on every available surface. A large cast-iron pot bubbled over the fire, filling the air with a spicy, medicinal smell. "You're planning the ritual of unmaking," Eliza said without preamble, gesturing for them to sit at a small table. "Do you understand what that means?" "It means I die," Henry said flatly. "My life to close the door Jack opened." Eliza nodded approvingly. "At least you're not a fool. Yes, the ritual requires a blood sacrifice, specifically the blood of someone connected to the summoner. Jack's blood connection to you is what makes you suitable." She studied him intently. "But there may be another way. A substitution." Hope flared in Henry's chest. "What kind of substitution?" "The root hungers for life force, for essence. It doesn't particularly care where it comes from, as long as the offering is strong enough." Eliza moved to a cabinet and removed a small wooden box. "In theory, enough life force from multiple sources could equal one complete sacrifice." Sarah leaned forward. "You mean several people giving a little instead of one person giving everything?" "Precisely." Eliza opened the box, revealing a set of small silver knives with elaborately carved handles. 7 participants, each giving a portion of their essence, might be enough to satisfy the requirements of the ritual. 7 people willing to risk their lives, Henry said skeptically. "Where would we find them?" "People who've been directly touched by the root," Eliza replied. "Those who've seen its true nature and survived. They're already marked, already connected." She looked pointedly at Sarah. "Like you, dear." Sarah unconsciously touched the circular scar on her wrist. "There are others in town, people who've had experiences, but getting them to help will be my job," Henry finished. "If they're willing to risk themselves to end this thing, I'm willing to lead them." Another tremor shook the cottage, stronger than the previous ones. A jar fell from a shelf, shattering on the floor and releasing a cloud of pungent-smelling powder. "It's accelerating," Eliza said, frowning. "We have less time than I thought. The ritual must be performed at midnight when the veil between worlds is thinnest." She began gathering supplies with quick, efficient movements. "Sarah, help me prepare the water of vision. Mr. Caldwell, there's a list on that table of the people in town who've been marked. You need to convince at least 6 of them to join us tonight." Henry picked up the paper she indicated. 7 names were written in a spidery hand. Sarah Winters, hospice nurse. Thomas Collins, deputy. Marion Havish, librarian. Daniel Webb, high school teacher. Lucy Connor, diner waitress. Frank Moss, groundskeeper, Pastor James Wilson, First Methodist. Deputy Collins? Henry said in surprise. He's marked, with ambulances and police vehicles, and a steady stream of injured people flowed through the emergency entrance. No one questioned Henry as he slipped inside, wearing an expression of determined purpose that suggested he belonged there. Finding the blood bank proved easier than he'd expected. Clear signs directed him to the basement level. Getting inside would be another matter entirely. A security keypad protected the entrance, and through the small window in the door, Henry could see refrigerated units lining the walls, each containing hundreds of labeled blood bags. He was considering his options when a voice behind him asked, "Can I help you?" Henry turned to find a young man in scrubs watching him suspiciously. "I hope so," Henry said, deciding honesty might be his best approach. "I need to access a specific blood donation. It's a family emergency." The man's suspicion didn't waver. "This area is restricted. You need authorization from Dr. Levine or the head nurse." Before Henry could respond, another tremendous tremor shook the building, this one strong enough to knock both men off their feet. The lights flickered, then went out completely, leaving them in darkness for several seconds before emergency generators kicked in, bathing the corridor in dim red light. An alarm began to sound, and a voice over the intercom called for immediate evacuation of the East Wing. "Structural damage," the man in scrubs said, scrambling to his feet. "We need to get out of here." "Wait," Henry said desperately. "My brother donated blood here. Jack Caldwell, cancer patient. I need his blood for a procedure that might stop all this." He gestured around them as another, smaller tremor rattled through the building. The young man hesitated, clearly torn between protocol and the increasingly dangerous situation. "Jack Caldwell? I remember him. He was in my donation group every month." He glanced nervously at the ceiling as dust sifted down. "What do you mean? Stop all this?" "The earthquakes, the roots breaking through. It's all connected to something in the old aspen grove," Henry explained quickly. "Jack found a way to stop it, but we need his blood. Please." Another alarm joined the first, more urgent in its tone. The decision made itself as a chunk of ceiling collapsed further down the corridor. "Screw it," the young man muttered, swiping his badge at the keypad. The door clicked open. "Make it quick." Inside, Henry scanned the refrigerated units, each labeled with letters corresponding to blood types. "He would have been O positive," he said, moving toward that section. The technician nodded. "Special donations are kept in the back unit. Cancer patients' blood is stored separately for research purposes." He led Henry to a smaller refrigerator at the rear of the room. Inside, neatly labeled bags were arranged alphabetically. The technician quickly located one marked Caldwell, J, and handed it to Henry. "This is probably his last donation from about 4 months ago," he said. "Will it be enough?" Henry stared at the dark red bag in his hands, feeling a strange mix of emotions. This was all that remained of his brother's physical presence in the world. A pint of blood preserved in a plastic bag. Would it be enough for the ritual? It would have to be. "Yes," he said. "Thank you. Now we need to evacuate," the technician insisted as another tremor shook dust from the ceiling. This whole place could come down any minute. They hurried back upstairs, joining the stream of staff and patients heading for the exits. Outside, the sky had turned an impossible shade of greenish-black, with lightning now striking almost continuously. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the sounds of breaking glass and groaning wood from damaged buildings. "Good luck with whatever you're trying to do," the technician said before rushing off to help an elderly patient into an ambulance. Henry carefully placed Jack's blood in a small cooler he found abandoned near the hospital entrance, then made his way back to his truck. According to his watch, it was nearly 8 o'clock, 2 hours until he needed to be at Eliza's cottage. The drive there should take 30 minutes under normal circumstances, but with the roads as they were now, he started the engine, pulling carefully out of the hospital parking lot, trying not to think too hard about what would happen at midnight. Would the ritual work? And if it did, would he survive it? The book hadn't been entirely clear on that point, speaking only of balance and sacrifice. Perhaps with 7 contributors, including Jack's blood, the cost would be distributed enough that no one would have to die. Somehow, Henry doubted it would be that simple. As he drove through the increasingly damaged streets of Millfield, he thought of Jack, of the 20 wasted years of silence between them, of all the things left unsaid. If he survived tonight, he promised himself he would live differently. Wouldn't let pride and old grudges keep him from the people who mattered. The truck's headlights illuminated a scene of devastation as he made his way out of town. Houses with walls torn open, cars crushed beneath fallen power lines, trees uprooted and tossed aside like toys. And everywhere, those pale, root-like tendrils pushing up through the earth, reaching, searching. Halfway to Eliza's cottage, a massive tremor struck, more violent than any before. The road ahead suddenly split open, a fissure at least 6 feet wide appearing as if drawn by an invisible hand. Henry slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a stop mere yards from the edge. He sat for a moment, heart pounding, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. There was no way forward by vehicle. He would have to continue on foot. Grabbing the cooler containing Jack's blood and the ancient book, Henry abandoned the truck and set out along the edge of the woods, following a path that ran roughly parallel to the road. The moon should have been rising by now, but the unnatural storm clouds blocked all natural light. Only the occasional flash of green lightning illuminated his way. The woods were unnaturally quiet. No insects chirping, no nocturnal animals rustling in the underbrush. Even the wind had died down, leaving a heavy stillness that pressed against Henry's ears like a physical weight. All he could hear was his own breathing and the soft crunch of his footsteps on the leaf-strewn path. And beneath that, almost subliminal, the whispering, "Henry, come to us. Join your brother. It's almost time." He tried to shut it out, focusing instead on putting one foot in front of the other, on keeping the book and the blood safe. But the voices grew stronger as he approached what had once been the aspen grove, now a tangled mass of fallen trunks and exposed roots stretching for acres in all directions. A rustling sound from his left made Henry freeze. He peered into the darkness between the trees, seeing nothing at first. Then a flash of lightning revealed a figure standing motionless about 20 yards away. Humanoid in shape, but wrong somehow, its proportions elongated and twisted. "Hello!" Henry called out, his voice sounding thin and frightened even to his own ears. The figure didn't respond, but it moved, a jerky, unnatural motion like stop-motion animation. With each flash of lightning, it appeared closer, though Henry never actually saw it walking. Instead, it seemed to jump forward during the moments of darkness between flashes. Henry backed away, then turned and ran, no longer caring about being quiet. Behind him, he heard more rustling, more movement. Not just one figure now, but many, pursuing him through the woods with that same jerky, impossible motion. He burst out of the tree line onto Eliza's property, gasping for breath. The cottage ahead was ablaze with light, every window glowing warmly in the unnatural darkness. Henry sprinted across the overgrown yard, the sounds of pursuit growing closer with each step. Eliza opened the door before he could even knock, ushering him inside and quickly bolting it behind him. "We were beginning to worry," she said, eyeing the cooler in his hands. "You found Jack's blood?" Henry nodded, still trying to catch his breath. "There's something out there, following me. Multiple somethings. The Root's servants," Eliza said grimly. "It's sending everything it has to stop us." She led him into the main room of the cottage, where Sarah and Marion sat at the table, surrounded by ritual preparations. Various herbs and powders were arranged in small piles, and 7 silver knives, the same ones Eliza had shown them earlier, were laid out in a careful pattern. "Deputy Collins?" Henry asked, noticing his absence. "Called in," Sarah explained. "Said he got held up dealing with a situation in town, but he'll meet us at the ritual site." "And Webb?" "Lucy Connor." "No sign of either yet," Marion said, glancing at the clock on the wall. It was 9:15. "We need to start preparing soon if we're going to reach the center of the grove by midnight." "We can't wait much longer," Eliza agreed. The boundary between our world and what lies beneath is growing thinner by the hour. If we don't perform the ritual tonight, she didn't need to finish the thought. They all knew what was at stake. Henry placed the cooler on the table and opened it, revealing Jack's blood bag still intact. Will this work as our 7th participant? Eliza examined it thoughtfully. It's not ideal. Living donors provide stronger essence. But blood freely given, especially from the one who opened the doorway originally. Yes, it should serve. And the ritual itself? Henry asked. What exactly happens at midnight? The old woman met his gaze steadily. At the moment when the veil is thinnest, we will open a channel between our world and the root's domain. Each marked individual will offer a portion of their essence. Blood primarily, but also intent and will. This creates a balanced equation, a closing of the circle Jack opened. And what happens to the donors? Henry pressed. You mentioned substitution, spreading the sacrifice among 7 people. Does that mean everyone survives? A heavy silence fell over the room. Sarah and Marion exchanged uncomfortable glances. The honest answer is I don't know, Eliza finally said. This ritual is ancient, performed only twice before in Millfield's history, and never with a substitution like I'm proposing. It's experimental. You're experimenting with people's lives, Henry said flatly. Would you prefer the alternative? Eliza countered. One definite death, yours, or the possibility that everyone survives at a cost? What kind of cost? Marion asked quietly. Eliza sighed. Life force is not just about physical existence. It's about potential possibility. The years ahead of you, the things you might create or experience. The ritual will take something from each participant. Maybe years off your lifespan, maybe memories, maybe joy. I can't predict exactly what each person will lose. But will live, Sarah pressed. Most likely, Eliza nodded. Though life might feel diminished afterward. Henry thought about this. A diminished life versus no life at all. And if he went through with the original sacrifice, giving himself entirely to close the door Jack had opened, would that even work? Or would the root simply find another victim, another blood connection to exploit? A sudden pounding at the door interrupted his thoughts. Eliza moved cautiously toward it, peering through a small peephole. It's Daniel Webb, she announced, unbolting the door. The teacher stumbled in, his clothes torn and dirty, a fresh cut bleeding on his forehead. We were attacked, he gasped. At the Anderson barn. Those things, like people but made of bark and roots. They took most of my group. Took them where? Henry demanded. Into the woods, Webb said, collapsing into a chair. Dragged them away. I only got away because Deputy Collins showed up, started firing at the creatures. He looked around wildly. Isn't he here? A chill ran down Henry's spine. He said he'd meet us at the ritual site. That's not possible, Webb insisted. He was right behind me, covering my escape. Then something reached up from the ground and he swallowed hard. Pulled him down. I saw it. He's gone. Sarah made a small, distressed sound. That leaves us short again. Even with Jack's blood, we're only 6 now. 5, came a new voice from the doorway. They all turned to see Lucy Connor standing there, her perfect features set in a determined expression. Eliza must have left the door unbolted after letting Webb in. I've made my decision, Lucy continued, stepping inside. I'll help with the ritual. Thank you, Henry said, relief flooding through him. Lucy shook her head. Don't thank me yet. I have conditions. What kind of conditions? Eliza asked sharply. After this is over, if we survive, I want normalcy, Lucy said. I want to age like a regular person, live out whatever years I have left in peace. No more whispers, no more bargains. Just release. She touched the hidden deformity beneath her hair. And I want this gone, if possible. The ritual should sever all connections to the root, Eliza confirmed, including whatever transformations it's begun. But I can't promise how many years you'll have afterward. The ritual will take its toll. Any life free of that thing is better than centuries bound to it, Lucy said firmly. Another violent tremor shook the cottage, this one strong enough to knock books from shelves and send a jar of herbs crashing to the floor. The whispering that had been at the edge of Henry's awareness suddenly surged in volume, becoming a cacophony of voices that seemed to emanate from the very walls around them. Too late, too late. We are here already. We are everywhere. We need to go, Eliza said urgently, beginning to gather the ritual supplies. It knows what we're planning. It's accelerating its emergence. But we're still one short, Marion pointed out. Without Collins, I'll take a double portion, Henry decided. Jack's blood and mine. As his brother, I have the strongest connection anyway. That could kill you, Sarah warned. So could doing nothing, Henry replied. We're out of options and out of time. Eliza studied him for a moment, then nodded. It might work. The bloodline connection could be strong enough to channel both portions. She turned to the others. Gather only what you need. We leave in 5 minutes. As they prepared, the whispering grew louder still, punctuated now by a rhythmic thumping that seemed to come from beneath the cottage floor, like a massive heartbeat, or something enormous moving slowly but inexorably toward the surface. Henry clutched Jack's journal, which he'd been carrying in his jacket pocket since leaving the house. In it, his brother had described the center of the aspen grove in detail. The ancient stone circle, the strange markings carved into the rocks, the unnatural stillness that pervaded the area. Jack had performed his original ritual there, opening a doorway that should have remained closed. Now Henry would attempt to shut it forever. Ready? Eliza announced. A canvas bag filled with ritual supplies slung over her shoulder. She handed each person a flashlight. Stay close together. Don't stop for anything. And don't listen to any voices you might hear calling your name. She led them out into the night, where the storm had intensified, wind now whipping through the trees with enough force to bend their trunks. The green lightning flashed almost continuously, casting their surroundings in an alien glow that made familiar landscapes seem twisted and wrong. The group moved as quickly as they could toward what had once been the aspen grove, now a tangle of fallen trunks and exposed roots stretching for acres. Henry carried the cooler containing Jack's blood in one hand and a heavy flashlight in the other, constantly scanning the darkness around them for signs of the bark creatures he'd seen earlier. Look, Sarah whispered at one point, pointing ahead. In the distance, dozens of pale shapes moved among the fallen trees, not just the humanoid figures Henry had seen before, but other forms as well. Four-legged creatures like deer but with too many limbs, birds with wingspans impossibly wide, things that slithered and crawled with no discernible shape at all made of the same pale, bark-like substance, all moving with that jerky, unnatural motion. Root servants, Eliza murmured. Vessels it creates to interact with our world. They're drawn to the center, guarding it. How do we get past them? Marion asked, her voice trembling slightly. In answer, Eliza reached into her bag and produced a handful of small cloth pouches. Protection wards. They won't keep the servants away entirely, but they should confuse them enough for us to pass. She distributed the pouches. Keep these close. With the wards in hand, they continued forward, entering the devastated grove. The going was difficult. They had to climb over fallen trunks, navigate around massive root structures that jutted from the earth like prehistoric skeletons. All around them, the root servants prowled, sometimes approaching within yards of the group before veering away, heads tilting in apparent confusion. The whispering was constant now, coming from everywhere and nowhere. Henry, brother of Jack, we remember the taste of your bloodline, sweet and strong. Join us freely, or we will take you piece by piece. Henry tried to shut it out, focusing instead on the path ahead. He noticed the others wincing occasionally, pressing hands to their ears, each hearing their own personalized torment. He realized, after what felt like hours but was probably only 40 minutes, they reached a clearing where the devastation of the grove gave way to an unnatural order. Perfectly spaced stones, 9 of them, formed a circle about 30 feet in diameter. At the center stood a larger stone, rectangular and flat-topped like an altar. Unlike the surrounding area, No fallen trees or debris had landed within the circle. It remained pristine, untouched by the destruction that had claimed the rest of the grove. "This is it," Eliza said, her voice hushed with a mixture of awe and fear. The doorway Jack opened. They approached cautiously. As they crossed the invisible boundary of the circle, Henry felt a change in the air, a sudden heaviness, as if the atmosphere itself had thickened. The whispering voices fell silent, replaced by a low, rhythmic pulsing that he felt rather than heard, like a second heartbeat inside his chest. "It's stronger than I expected," Eliza admitted, her face pale in the green-tinged light. "The door isn't just open. It's almost gone entirely. Can we still close it?" Sarah asked. "We have to try." Eliza began unpacking her supplies, arranging them on the central altar stone. The 7 silver knives, small bowls of various powders and herbs, candles that she quickly lit despite the wind that howled around, but strangely, not within the stone circle. "It's 11:40, Webb noted, checking his watch. "Almost time." Henry placed the cooler containing Jack's blood on the altar and opened it. The bag inside pulsed gently, as if the blood were somehow still alive, still connected to something. "We need the book," Eliza said. Henry produced the ancient tome from inside his jacket, handling it carefully as he placed it on the altar. Eliza opened it to a page marked with a thin ribbon, scanning the faded text with narrowed eyes. "Each participant must stand before one of the outer stones," she instructed. "Henry, you'll take 2 positions, yours and the one where Jack's blood will be placed." They arranged themselves as directed, forming a rough circle around the altar. Eliza placed small bowls at each person's feet, then positioned the 7 silver knives, 1 at each station. The final knife she placed beside Jack's blood bag, which now sat in a shallow depression in the stone altar that seemed made for it. "When I begin the incantation, each of you will make a small cut on your palm," Eliza explained. "Let the blood drip into the bowl at your feet. Focus your intention on closing the door, on rejecting the root's presence in our world. Whatever you do, don't stop until I say it's finished." Henry took his position at one of the outer stones, feeling the cold, rough surface against his back. The sky above had turned a deep, nauseating green, the lightning now so frequent that it created a constant, flickering illumination. The ground trembled continuously, but within the stone circle, they remained steady, as if standing on an island in a turbulent sea. Eliza took her own place at the last empty stone, the book open in her hands. She began to speak in a language Henry didn't recognize, guttural syllables that seemed to catch in the throat, vowels that stretched unnaturally long. As she spoke, the atmosphere within the circle grew even heavier. Henry found it difficult to breathe, as if the air itself was pressing against his lungs. The pulsing sensation in his chest intensified, beating in counterpoint to his own racing heart. And then, at precisely midnight by Webb's watch, everything went still. The wind died, the lightning ceased, even the tremors paused. In that moment of perfect silence, Eliza nodded sharply, indicating it was time. Henry picked up the silver knife at his feet, its blade gleaming in the candlelight. Without hesitation, he drew it across his palm, wincing at the sharp sting. Dark blood welled up immediately, dripping into the bowl below. Around the circle, the others did the same, their faces set in expressions of determination and fear. As the blood pooled in the bowls, something changed in the center of the circle. The air above the altar seemed to ripple, like heat waves rising from hot asphalt. Within that ripple, shapes began to form, indistinct at first, then gradually more substantial. Faces pressed against what appeared to be a thin membrane separating 2 worlds, their features distorted and inhuman. Eliza's chanting grew louder, more urgent. Henry felt a pulling sensation, as if something was being drawn from him through the wound in his hand. Not just blood, but something deeper, more essential. His vision began to blur, the edges darkening. Across the circle, he saw the others similarly affected. Marion had fallen to her knees but kept her bleeding hand extended over the bowl. Lucy was swaying dangerously, her perfect features contorted in pain. Sarah and Webb stood firm, but their faces had gone gray, life literally draining from them. In the center, Jack's blood bag had begun to glow with an unnatural light. The blood inside moved of its own accord, swirling and pulsing as if trying to escape its plastic prison. Henry knew he needed to take his second position to represent both himself and Jack in the ritual. With tremendous effort, he pushed away from his stone and staggered to the empty station where Jack's knife and bowl waited. His legs felt leaden, each step requiring all his remaining strength. As he reached for the second knife, a voice stopped him. Jack's voice, clear as day, as if his brother stood right beside him. "Not like this, Henry. The substitution won't work. It needs one complete sacrifice. It was always meant to be me, but now it has to be you. Brother for brother." Henry hesitated, knife hovering above his already bleeding palm. Was this really Jack, or was it the root trying to trick him into giving more than was necessary? The rippling air above the altar suddenly bulged outward, the membrane stretching thin. Through it, Henry could see not just faces now, but an entire landscape. A twisted mirror of the aspen grove as it had once been, the trees inverted, their roots reaching toward a sky the color of congealed blood. And moving among those inverted trees, massive shadowy figures with too many limbs and no discernible features. "It's breaking through," Jack's voice warned. "The ritual is failing. It needs more." Henry made his decision. Instead of cutting his other palm, he drove the silver knife deep into his own chest, aiming for his heart. Pain exploded through him, but with it came a strange clarity. As he fell to his knees, he heard Eliza cry out in alarm, saw Sarah start toward him. But it was too late. Blood poured from the wound, spattering not into the bowl but directly onto the earth within the stone circle. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The ground beneath him split open, revealing not dirt and rock but a pulsing, organic mass that writhed with apparent agony. The membrane above the altar tore like tissue paper, releasing a howl that seemed to come from 1,000 throats at once. Henry collapsed fully now, his strength failing. Through dimming vision, he saw root-like tendrils erupting from the split earth, thrashing wildly in what could only be described as pain. The entire stone circle shook violently, the ancient rocks grinding against one another. "Get back!" Eliza screamed to the others. "The door is closing. It's taking everything connected to it." The others retreated to the edge of the circle, all except Sarah, who rushed to Henry's side. "What have you done?" she demanded, pressing her hands against his wound in a futile attempt to stop the bleeding. "Finishing what Jack started," Henry whispered, blood bubbling on his lips. "The ritual needed a life freely given." Around them, the destruction accelerated. The tendrils that had emerged from the earth began to wither and blacken, crumbling to dust. The membrane above the altar collapsed in on itself, the glimpse of that other world disappearing like water down a drain. The pulsing sensation in Henry's chest slowed, matching the fading beat of his heart. He knew he was dying, but strangely, he felt no fear, only a sense of completion, of balance restored. "Tell them," he gasped to Sarah. "Tell them Jack didn't fail. He found the way." Sarah's tears fell onto his face, mingling with the blood. "I'll tell them," she promised. "Everyone will know." Henry's vision narrowed to a single point of light. In that light, he thought he saw a figure approaching, tall and strong, nothing like the wasted man cancer had made of him at the end. Jack, as he had been in their youth, before the arguments, before the years of silence. "Well done, little brother," Jack said, extending his hand. "I've got you now. I won't let you fall." Henry reached out with the last of his strength, and the brothers' hands met across the divide between life and death. As darkness claimed him, Henry felt himself being lifted, carried away from the pain and the blood and the responsibility. The last thing he heard was Eliza's voice, finishing the ancient incantation with words that sounded like both an ending and a beginning. And then stillness. 1 year later, Sarah Winters stood at the edge of what was now called Caldwell Memorial Park, watching children play on the new equipment installed where the aspen grove had once stood. The town had decided a playground was the most fitting tribute to the man who had saved them all. A place of life and laughter to cover ground that had known only death and darkness for generations. After the events of that night, the tremors had stopped immediately. The root-like growths that had emerged throughout Millfield had withered and died by morning. Even the unnatural storm had dissipated, leaving behind a pristine blue sky that seemed almost obscenely cheerful in contrast to what had happened. They had buried Henry in the town cemetery with Deputy Collins, who had somehow survived being pulled beneath the earth, though he would walk with a limp for the rest of his life, giving the eulogy. It was attended by nearly everyone in Millfield, many of whom had never met Henry but knew what his sacrifice had meant. Sarah touched the scar on her wrist, now just a faint silver line, no longer the angry red circle it had been for years. None of the marked showed any signs of their connection to the root anymore. Lucy Connor had wept when she discovered the bark-like growth on her ear had disappeared, leaving normal skin in its place. She looked her true age now, a woman in her 80s, but moved with the energy of someone decades younger, freed from a burden she'd carried too long. Daniel Webb had stepped down from teaching, establishing instead a local historical society dedicated to documenting the true history of Millfield, both the good and the terrible. People needed to remember, he insisted, so that nothing like the root could ever take hold again. Marion Havish had helped, providing access to archives that had been deliberately obscured over the years. Together, they painted a picture of a town built on fear and sacrifice, of generations who had looked the other way while something ancient and hungry fed on their most vulnerable. And Eliza Garrett, who had witnessed 3 cycles of the root's emergence and dormancy in her long life, finally passed away peacefully in her sleep 6 months after the ritual. She left her cottage and all its contents to Sarah, who discovered journals dating back over a century, detailing everything the Garrett family had learned about the root and its servants. Sarah had continued Eliza's work in her own way, not as a witch or keeper of ancient knowledge, but as a hospice nurse who understood better than most the thin line between life and death, and the importance of crossing that threshold with dignity. She kept the cottage as a sort of sanctuary, a place where those with questions about what had happened could come and learn the truth. As she watched the children play, Sarah noticed a small sapling that had somehow taken root at the very edge of the playground. A young aspen, its leaves trembling in the autumn breeze. For a moment, fear gripped her. Could it be starting again? Had the root somehow survived? But as she approached the tree, she felt nothing of the oppressive presence that had marked the old grove. This was just a tree, innocent and natural, perhaps even a symbol of renewal, of life continuing despite everything. Sarah touched its smooth bark briefly, then turned away. Millfield was healing slowly but surely. The whispers that had haunted its residents for generations had fallen silent. The nightmares had faded. As she walked back toward town, Sarah thought she caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of her eye. A tall figure standing beneath the sapling, watching her go. She didn't turn to look, didn't need to. Some presences didn't need to be seen to be felt. "We remember," she murmured. "We'll always remember. Rest now, Henry. Rest now, Jack." The breeze seemed to strengthen momentarily, rustling through the sapling's golden leaves. It almost sounded like a response, a whisper, but not of hunger or ancient malice. Rather, it carried the simple satisfaction of completion, of balance restored. Sarah smiled and continued walking, leaving the Caldwell brothers to their eternal watch, guardians now of a place once haunted by darkness but reclaimed, at last, for the light. The end.